This is Audible.
Ashat Audio presents The Last Guardian, written by David Gemmell and read by Christian Rotzke. The Last Guardian is one of 3 books that make up the John Shannow series. Chapter 1. South of the Plague Lands, 2341 A.D. But he did not die. The flesh around the bullet wound over his hip froze as the temperature dropped to 30 below zero, and the distant spires of Jerusalem blurred and changed, becoming snow-shrouded pine. Ice had formed on his beard, and his heavy, black, double-shouldered topcoat glistened white in the moonlight. Shannow swayed in the saddle, trying to focus on the city he had sought for so long. But it was gone. As his horse stumbled, Shannow's right hand gripped the saddle pommel, and the wound in his side flared with fresh pain. He turned the black stallion's head, steering the beast downhill towards the valley. Images rushed through his mind. Caritas, Ruth, Donna, the hazardous journey across the Plague Lands, and the battles with the Hellborn, the monstrous ghost ship wrecked on a mountain. Guns and gunfire, war and death. The blizzard found new life, and the wind whipped freezing snow into Shannow's face. He could not see where he was heading, and his mind wandered. He knew that life was ebbing from his body with each passing second, but he had neither the strength nor the will to fight on. He remembered the farm and his first sight of Donna, standing in the doorway with an ancient crossbow in her hands. She'd mistaken Shannow for a brigand, and feared for her life and that of her son, Eric. Shannow had never blamed her for that mistake. He knew what people saw when the Jerusalem man came riding. A tall, gaunt figure in a flat-crowned leather hat, a man with cold, cold eyes that had seen too much of death and despair. Always it was the same. People would stand and stare, first at his expressionless face, and then their eyes would be drawn down to his guns, the terrible weapons of the Thundermaker. Yet Donna Tabard had been different. She'd taken Shannow to her hearth and her home, and for the first time in 2 weary decades the Jerusalem man had known happiness. But then had come the brigands and the war-makers, and finally the Hellborn. Shannow had gone against them all for the woman he loved, only to see her wed another. Now he was alone again, dying on a frozen mountain in an uncharted wilderness, and, strangely, he did not care. The wind howled about horse and man, and Shannow fell forward across the stallion's neck, lost in the siren song of the blizzard. The horse was mountain-bred. He did not like the howling wind, nor the biting snow. Now he angled his way through the trees into the lee of a rock face, and followed a deer trail down to the mouth of a high lava tunnel that stretched through the ancient volcanic range. It was warmer here, and the stallion plodded on, aware of the dead weight across his back. This disturbed him, for his rider was always in balance, and could signal his commands with the slightest pressure or flick of the reins. The stallion's wide nostrils flared as the smell of smoke came to him. He halted and backed up, his iron hooves clattering on the rocky floor. A dark shadow moved in front of him. In panic he reared, and Shannow tumbled from the saddle. A huge, taloned hand caught the reins, and the smell of lion filled the tunnel. The stallion tried to rear again, to lash out with iron-shod hooves, but he was held tight, and a soft, deep voice whispered to him, a gentle hand stroking his neck. Calmed by the voice, he allowed himself to be led into a deep cave, where a campfire had been set within a circle of round, flat stones. He waited calmly as he was tethered to a jutting stone at the far wall. Then the figure was gone. Outside the cave, Shannow groaned and tried to roll to his belly, but he was stricken by pain and deep cold. He opened his eyes to see a hideous face looming over him. Dark hair framed the head and face, and a pair of tawny eyes gazed down at him. The nose was wide and flat, the mouth a deep slash, rimmed with sharp fangs. Shannow, unable to move, could only glare at the creature. Taloned hands moved under his body, lifting him easily, and he was carried like a child into a cave and laid gently by a fire. The creature fumbled at the ties on Shannow's coat, but the thick, paw-like hands could not cope with the frozen knots. Talons hissed out to sever the leather thongs, and Shannow felt his coat eased from him. Slowly, but with great care, the creature removed his frozen clothing and covered him with a warm blanket. The Jerusalem man faded into sleep, and his dreams were pain-filled. Once more he fought the guardian lord Sorrento, while the Titanic sailed on a ghostly sea and the devil walked in Babylon. But this time Shannow could not win, and he struggled to survive as the sea poured into the stricken ship, engulfing him. He could hear the cries of drowning men, women, and children, but he could not save them. He awoke sweating and tried to sit. Pain ripped at his wounded side, and he groaned and sank back into his fever dreams. He was riding towards the mountains when he heard a shot. He rode to the crest of a hill and gazed down on a farmyard where 3 men were dragging 2 women from their home. Drawing a pistol, Shannow kicked his stallion into a run and thundered towards the scene. When the men saw him, they flung the women aside, and 2 of them drew flintlocks from their belts. The 3rd ran at him with a knife. He dragged on the reins, and the stallion reared. Shannow timed his first shot well, and a brigand was punched from his feet. The knife man leapt, but Shannow swung in the saddle and fired point-blank, the bullet entering the man's forehead and exiting from the neck in a bloody spray. The 3rd man loosed a shot that ricocheted from the pommel of Shannow's saddle to tear into his hip. Ignoring the sudden pain, the Jerusalem man fired twice. The first shell took the brigand high in the shoulder, spinning him. The second hammered into his skull. In the sudden silence, Shannow sat his stallion, gazing at the women. The elder of the 2 approached him, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Blood was seeping from his wound and dripping to the saddle, but he sat upright as she neared. "What do you want of us?" she asked. "Nothing, lady. Safe to help you." "Well," she said, her eyes hard, "you've done that, and we thank you." She backed away, still staring at him. He knew she could see the blood, but he would not beg for aid. "Good day to you," he said, swinging the stallion and heading away. The younger girl ran after him. Blonde and pretty, her face was leathered by the sunlight and the hardship of wilderness farming. She gazed up at him with large blue eyes. "I'm sorry," she told him. "My mother distrusts all men. I'm so sorry." "Get away from him, girl!" shouted the older woman, and she fell back. Shannow nodded. "She probably has good reason," he said. "I'm sorry I cannot stay and help you bury these vermin." "You are wounded. Let me help you." "No, there is a city near here, I'm sure. It has white spires and gates of burnished gold. There they will tend me." "There are no cities," she said. "I will find it." He touched his heels to the stallion's flanks and rode from the farmyard. A hand touched him, and he awoke. The bestial face was leaning over him. "How are you feeling?" The voice was deep and slow and slurred, and the question had to be repeated twice before Shannow could understand it. "I'm alive, thanks to you. Who are you?" The creature's great head tilted. "Good. Usually the question is, what are you? My name is Sharon. You are a strong man to live so long with such a wound." "The ball passed through me," said Shannow. "Can you help me sit?" "No. Lie there. I have stitched the wounds front and back, but my fingers are not what they were. Lie still and rest tonight. We will talk in the morning." "My horse?" "Safe. He was a little frightened of me,
but we understand each other now. I fed him the grain you carried in your saddlebags. Sleep, man."
Shannow relaxed and moved his hand under the blankets to rest on the wound over his right hip. He could feel the tightness of the stitches and the clumsy knots. There was no bleeding, but he was worried about the fibres from his coat, which had been driven into his flesh. It was these that killed more often than ball or shell, aiding gangrene and poisoning the blood.
"It's a good wound,"
said Chiran, softly, as if reading his mind.
"The issue of blood cleansed it, I think. But here in the mountains wounds heal well. The air is clean. Bacteria find it hard to survive at 30 below."
"Bacteria?" whispered Shannow, his eyes closing.
"Germs, the filth that causes wounds to fester."
"I see. Thank you, Chiran." And Shannow slept without dreams. Shannow awoke, hungry, and eased himself to a sitting position. The fire was burning brightly, and he could see a large store of wood stacked against the far wall. Gazing around the cave, he saw it was some 50 feet across at the widest point, and the high domed ceiling was pitted with fissures, through which the smoke from the fire drifted lazily. Beside Shannow's blankets were his water canteen, his leather-bound Bible, and his guns, still sheathed in their oiled leather scabbards. Taking the canteen, he pulled clear the brass-topped cork and drank deeply. Then, in the bright firelight, he examined the bullet wound in his hip. The flesh around it was angry, bruised and inflamed, but it looked clean, and there was no bleeding. Slowly and carefully he stood, scanning the cave for his clothes. They were dry and casually folded atop a boulder on the other side of the fire. Dried blood still caked the white woolen shirt, but he slipped it on and climbed into his black woolen trousers. He could not buckle his belt on the usual notch, for the leather bit into his wound, bringing a grunt of pain. Still, he felt more human now he was clothed. He pulled on socks and high riding boots and walked to where his stallion was tethered at the far wall. Shannow stroked his neck, and the horse dropped his head and nuzzled him in the chest. "Careful, boy. I'm still tender." He half-filled the feed bag with grain and settled it over the stallion's head. Of Chiran there was no sign. Near the wood store was a bank of rough-hewn shelves. Some carried books, others small sacks of salt, sugar, dried fruit, and meat. Shannow ate some of the fruit and returned to the fire. The cave was warm, and he lay back in his blankets and took up his guns, cleaning them with care. Both were hellborn pistols, single or double action, side-feed weapons. He opened his saddlebag and checked his shells. He still had 47, but when these were gone, the beautifully balanced pistols would be useless. Delving deep into the saddlebag, he found his own guns, cap-and-ball percussion pistols, that had served him well for 20 years. For these he could make his own powder and mould ammunition. Having cleaned them, he wrapped them in oilskin and returned them to the depths of the saddlebag. Only then did he take up his Bible. It was a well-thumbed book, the pages thin and gold-edged, the leather cover as supple as silk. He banked up the fire and opened the pages at the Book of Habakkuk. He read the section aloud, his voice deep and resonant. "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife, and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted." "And how does your
God answer John Shannow?"
asked Shiran. "In his own way," Shannow answered. "How is it you know my name?" The huge creature ambled forward, his great shoulders bowed under the weight of the enormous head. He sank to the floor by the fire, and Shannow noticed that his breathing was ragged. A thin trickle of blood could be seen coming from his right ear, matting the dark hair of his mane. "Are you hurt?" asked Shannow.
"No, it is the change, that is all. You found food?"
"Yes, some dried fruit in crystallized honey. It was good."
"Take it all. I can no longer stomach it. How is your wound?"
"Healing well, as you promised. You seem in pain, Shiran. Is there anything I can do?"
"Nothing, Shannow, save perhaps to offer me a little company."
"And that'll be a pleasure. It is too long since I sat by a fire, secure and at peace. Tell me how you know me."
"Of you, Shannow. The Dark Lady speaks of you and your deeds against the Hellborn. You are a strong man, a brave friend, I think."
"Who is this, Dark Lady?" countered Shannow, uncomfortable with the compliments.
"She is who she is, dark and beautiful. She labours among the Diani, my people, and the Wolvers. The bears will not receive her, for their humanity is all gone. They are beasts, now and forever. Oh, I am tired, Shannow. I will rest. Sleep."
He settled down on his belly, taloned hands supporting his head. His tawny eyes closed, then opened.
When you can no longer understand me, then saddle your stallion and ride on. You understand?"
"No," replied Shannow.
"You will," said Shiran.
Shannow ate some more fruit and returned to his Bible. Habakkuk had long been a favourite. Short and bitter-sweet were his words, but they echoed the doubts and the fears in Shannow's heart, and, reflecting them, calmed them. For 3 days Shannow sat with Shiran, but although they talked often, the Jerusalem man learned little of the Diani. What meagre information the creature did impart told Shannow of a land where men were slowly changing into beasts. There were the people of the lion, the wolf, and the bear. The bears were finished, their culture gone. The wolves were dying out. Only the lion people remained. Shiran spoke of the beauty of life, of its pains and its glories, and Shannow began to realize that the great creature was dying. They did not speak of it, but day by day Shiran's body changed, swelling, twisting, until he could not stand upright. Blood flowed from both ears now, and his speech was ever more slurred. At night in his sleep he would growl. On the 4th morning Shannow awoke to hear his stallion whinnying in terror. He rolled from his bed, his hands sweeping out and gathering a pistol. Shiran was crouched before the horse, his head swaying. "What's wrong?" called Shannow. Shiran swung, and Shannow found himself staring into the tawny eyes of a huge lion. It advanced on him in a rush and leapt, but Shannow hurled himself to his right, hitting the ground hard. Pain lanced his side, but he swiveled as the lion surged at him, its roaring filling the cave. "Shiran!" bellowed Shannow. The lion twisted its head, and for a moment Shannow saw the light of understanding in its eyes. Then it was gone. Again the beast leapt. A pistol shot thundered in the cave. The creature that had been Shiran sank to the floor and rolled to its side, eyes locked to Shannow's own. The Jerusalem man moved forward and knelt by the body, laying his hand upon the black mane. "I am sorry," he said. The eyes closed, and all breathing ceased. Shannow laid aside his pistol and took up his Bible. "You saved my life, Shiran, and I took yours.
That is not just, yet I had no choice. I do not know how to pray for you, for I do not know if you were man or beast. But you were kind to me, and for that I commend your soul to the All-High." He opened his Bible. Laying his left hand on Chiron's body, he read, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world, all who live in it, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to an idol or swear by what is false." He walked to the trembling stallion and saddled him. Then he gathered what remained of the food, stepped into the saddle, and rode from the cave. Behind him the fire flickered and died. Chapter 2. The city of Ad, 9364 B.C. The temple was a place of great beauty still, with its white spires and golden domes, but the once tranquil courtyards were now thronged with people baying for the blood sacrifice. The white tent at the entrance to the holy circle had been removed, and in its place stood a marble statue of the king, regal and mighty, arms outstretched. Nu Khasisatra stood in the crowd, his limbs trembling. 3 times had the vision come to him, and 3 times had he pushed it aside. "I cannot do this, Lord," he whispered. "I do not have the strength." He turned away from the spectacle as the victim was brought out and eased his way through the crowds. He heard the new high priest chant the opening lines of the ritual, but he did not look back. Tears stung his eyes as he stumbled along the corridors of white marble, emerging at last at the pool of silence. He sat at the pool's edge. The roar of the crowd was muted here, yet still he heard the savage joy which heralded the death of another innocent. "Forgive me," he said. Gazing down into the pool, he looked at the fish swimming there, and above them his own reflection. The face was strong and square, the eyes deep-set, the beard full. He'd never considered it the face of a weak man. His hand snaked out, disturbing the water. The sleek silver and black fish scattered, carrying his reflection with them. "What can one man do, Lord? You can see them. The king has brought them wealth and peace, prosperity and long life. They would tear me to pieces." A sense of defeat settled upon him. In the past 3 months he had organized secret meetings, preaching against the excesses of the king. He'd helped the outlawed priests of Kronos to escape the daggers, smuggling them from the city. But now he shrank from the last commitment. He was ashamed that love of life was stronger than love of God. His vision swam, the sky darkened, and Nu Khasisatra felt himself torn from his body. He soared into the sky and hovered over the gleaming city below. In the distance a deeper darkness gathered, then a bright light shone beyond the darkness. A great wind blew, and Nu trembled as the sea roared up to meet the sky. The mighty city was like a toy now, as the ocean thundered across the land. Huge trees disappeared under the waves like grass beneath a river flood. Mountains were swallowed whole. The stars flew across the sky, and the sun rose majestically in the west. Looking down upon the city of his birth, Nu Khasisatra saw only the deep blue-grey of an angry sea. His spirit sank below the waves, deeper and deeper into the darkness. The pool of silence was truly silent now, and the black fish were gone. Bodies floated by him, men, women, tiny babes. Unencumbered by the water, Nu walked back to the central square. The statue of the king still stood with arms outstretched, but a huge black shark brushed against it. Slowly the statue toppled, striking a pillar. The head sheared off, and the body bounced against the mosaic tiles. "No!" screamed Nu. "No!" His body jerked, and once more he was sitting by the pool.
Bright sunlight streamed above the temple, and doves circled the wooden parapets of the Wailing Tower. He stood, swept his sky-blue cloak over his shoulder, and marched back to the courtyard of the Holy Circle. The crowd was milling now, and the priests were lifting the victim's body from the flat grey sacrifice stone. Blood stained the surface, and had run down the carved channels to disappear through the golden vents. Nu Khasisatra strode to the steps and walked slowly towards the sacrifice stone. At first no one made a move to stop him, but as he drew nearer to the stone, a red-robed priest intercepted him. "You cannot approach the holy place," said the priest.
"What holy place?" countered Nu. "You have corrupted it."
He thrust the man aside and walked to the stone. Some people in the crowd had watched the altercation and now began to whisper. "What's he doing? Did you see him strike the priest?
Is he a madman?"
All eyes turned to the broad-shouldered man at the stone as he removed his blue cloak. Beneath it he wore the white robes of a priest of Kronos. Temple guards gathered at the foot of the steps, but it was forbidden to carry a weapon to the holy place, and they stood their ground uncertain. 3 priests approached the man at the sacrifice stone.
"What madness is this?" asked one. "Why do you desecrate this temple?" "How dare you speak of desecration?" countered Nu Khasisatra. "The temple was dedicated to Kronos, Lord of Light, Lord of Life. No blood sacrifice was ever made here." "The king is the living image of Kronos," the priest argued, "the conqueror of worlds, the Lord of heaven. All who deny this are traitors and heretics." "Then count me among them," roared Nu, and his huge hands took hold of the sacrifice stone and wrenched it clear of its supports. Forcing his fingers under the stone, he lifted it high above his head and hurled it out over the steps, where it shattered. An angry roar rose from the crowd. Nu Khasisatra leapt to stand upon the altar base. "Faithless people!" he shouted. "The end of all days is upon you. You have mocked the Lord of creation, and your doom will be terrible. The seas will rise against you, and not one stone will be left upon another. Your bodies will be dashed to the deep, and your dreams will be forgotten, even as you are forgotten. You have heard that the king is the living God? Blasphemy! Who brought the roiling stones from the vault of heaven? Who led the chosen people to this bountiful land? Who dashed the hopes of the wicked in the year of dragons? It was Kronos, through his prophets. And where was the king? Unborn and unmade. He is a man, and his evil is colossal. He will destroy the world. You have wives and sons. You have loved ones. All will die. Not one of you listening to these words will be alive at year's end." "Drag him down!" shouted someone in the crowd. "Kill him!" yelled another, and the cry was taken up by the mob. The temple guards drew their swords and ran up the steps. Lightning seared amongst them, leaping from sword to sword, and the guards, their flesh blackened, toppled to the stone. A great silence settled on the crowd. Smoke drifted up from the bodies of the guards as Nu Khasisatra raised his hands to the heavens. "There is no turning back now," he said. "All will be as I have told it. The sun will rise in the west, and the oceans will thunder across the land. You will see the sword of God in the heavens, and despair." He stepped down from the altar and walked slowly past the dead guards. The crowd parted before him as he marched from the temple. "I recognise him," said a man as he passed by. "That was Nu Khasisatra, a shipbuilder. He lives in the south quarter." The name was whispered amongst the mob and carried from the temple, coming at last to the woman Shahrazad, and the hunt began. Chapter 3. For 3 days Shannow travelled south, the trails winding ever down into a long valley of half-frozen streams and tall stands of pine, wide meadows and rolling hills.
He saw little game, but came across tracks of deer and elk. Each day, around mid-morning, he would halt in a spot shielded from the wind and clear the snow from the grass, allowing the stallion to eat, while Shannow himself sat by a small fire, reading his Bible or thinking about the journey ahead. His wounds were healing fast. Shiran had done a fine job on them. He thought of the strange man-beast often, and came to the conclusion that Shiran had wanted his company for just the purpose it had served. The man-beast had stitched his wounds, then left his guns by his side. Yet within the sanctuary of the cave he had no need of weapons. The doomed creature had spoken of the change, and it had been awesome to witness, the move from humanity to bestiality. What could cause such a transformation, Shannow had no idea, but in the strange world after Armageddon there were many mysteries. 2 years before, in a bid to rescue Samuel Archer and the reformed hellborn Batik, Shannow had seen at first hand a new race of people called Wolvers, part man and part animal. Archer himself had spoken of other such creatures, though Shannow had yet to see them. It was warmer here in the valley, and as he moved further south, the snow thinned, great patches of verdant grass shimmering on the hillsides. Every day Shannow scanned the skies, looking for the signs of wonder, but ever the heavens remained blue and clear. On the 4th day, as dusk gathered, Shannow guided the stallion into a wood seeking a campsite. Ahead, through the tall trees, he glimpsed a glittering fire. "Hello, the camp!" he yelled. At first there was no answer, then a gruff voice called out, beckoning him in. Shannow waited for a moment and then delved into his pack, bringing out the short-nosed percussion pistol and tucking it into his belt just inside the flap of his long coat. Then he rode forward. There were 4 men sitting around the fire and 5 horses tethered to a picket line. Shannow stepped from the saddle and tied his stallion's reins to a jutting root. On the fire a large black pot was hanging from a tripod, and within it Shannow could smell a simmering broth. Casually he moved to the fire and squatted down, his eyes sweeping the group. They were hard men, for the most part lean and wolf-like. Shannow had known men like these all his life. His gaze halted on a burly, round-shouldered man with a short-cropped salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that were merely slits under heavy lids. There was a tension in the air, but it did not affect the Jerusalem man, though he acknowledged it. His eyes locked to the burly man, and he waited. "Eat," said the man at last, his voice low. "After you," said Shannow. "I would not wish to be impolite." The man smiled, showing stained teeth. "The wilderness is no place for manners." He reached out and ladled some broth into a metal dish, and the others followed suit. As the tension grew, Shannow took a dish with his left hand and placed it before the fire. Then, still with his left hand, he lifted the ladle and filled the bowl, drawing it to him. Slowly he finished the meal and pushed the plate from him. "Thank you," he said into the silence. "It was most welcome." "Help yourself to more," offered the leader. "No, thank you. There will not be enough left for your scout." The leader swung round. "Come in, Zach. Supper's waiting," he called. Across from the fire, a young man rose from the bushes, a long rifle in his hands. He walked slowly to the fire, avoiding Shannow's gaze, and sat beside the leader with the rifle by his side. Shannow rose and moved to his stallion, untying his blanket roll and spreading his bed beside the horse. Loosening the cinch, he lifted the saddle and dropped it to the ground. Then, taking a brush from his saddlebag, he ducked under the stallion's neck and with smooth, even strokes groomed the horse. He did not look at the men around the fire, but the silence grew. The Jerusalem man had been tempted to finish his meal and ride on, to be clear of the immediate danger, but such a move would be foolishness, he knew. These men were brigands and killers, and to ride on would display weakness like the scent of blood to a wolf pack. He patted the stallion's neck and returned to his bed. Without a word to the men, he removed his hat and lay down, pulling a blanket over him and closing his eyes. At the fire, the young man reached for his rifle, but the leader gripped his arm and shook his head. The youth pulled his arm clear. "What the devil's wrong with you?" he whispered. "Let's take him now. That there is one hell of a horse, and his guns. Do you see them guns?" "I saw," answered the leader, "and I saw the man who wears them. You see how he rode in? Careful. He spotted you right away, and hunkered down where you couldn't get no shot. And all through the meal he only used his left hand. And where was his right? I'll tell you where. It was inside that long coat, and it weren't scratching his belly. Now you leave it be, boy. I'll think on it." Towards midnight, with all the men asleep in their blankets, the youth rose silently, a double-edged knife in one hand. He crept forward towards where Shannow slept. A dark figure loomed behind him, and a pistol clubbed across the youth's neck. He fell without a sound. The leader holstered his pistol and dragged the boy back to his blankets. 20 feet away, Shannow smiled and returned his own gun to its scabbard. The leader walked across to him. "I know you ain't asleep," he said. "Who the hell are you?" Shannow sat up. "My boy will have a sore head. I hope he has enough sense to thank you for it." "The name's Lee Patterson," the man answered, thrusting out his right hand. Shannow smiled at him, but ignored the offer. "John Shannow." "Jesus God Almighty, you hunting us?" "No, I'm riding south." Lee grinned. "You want to see them statues in the sky, eh? The sword of God, Shannow?" "You've seen them?" "Not me, man. They call that the Wild Lands. There's no settlements there, no way for a man to make a living. But I seen a man once who swore he'd stood under 'em. He said it gave him religion. Me, I don't need no religion. You sure you're not hunting us?" "You have my word." "Why did you save the boy?" "A man don't have too many sons, Shannow. I had 3. One got killed when I lost me farm. Another was shot down after we took to the road. He was hit in the leg. It went bad, and I had to cut it from him. Can you imagine that, Shannow? Cutting the leg from your son? And he died anyway, 'cause I left it too long. It's a hard life and no mistake." "What happened to your wife?" "She died. There's no land for women. It burns 'em out. You got a woman, Shannow?" "No, I have no one." "I guess that's what makes you dangerous." "I guess it does," Shannow agreed. Lee stood and stretched. He looked down. "You ever find Jerusalem, Shannow?" "Not yet." "When you do, ask him a question, will you? Ask him, what the hell is the point of it all?" Chapter 4. Nu Khasisatra ran from the temple, out onto the broad steps and down into the teeming multitudes who thronged the city thoroughfares. His courage was exhausted, and reaction had set in. His limbs were trembling as he pushed his way through the crowds, trying to lose himself among the thousands who packed the market streets. "Are you a priest?" a man asked him, clutching his sleeve. "No," snapped Nu. "Leave me alone." "But you wear the robes," the man persisted. "Leave me!" roared Nu, wrenching the man's hand from him. Once more, swallowed by the throng, he cut left into an alleyway and walked swiftly through to the street of merchants. Here he bought a heavy cloak. It had a deep hood, which he pulled over his dark hair. He stopped at an eating house on the crossroads corner, taking a table by the east window, where he sat staring out onto the street, overwhelmed by the enormity of his deed. He was a traitor and a heretic. There was nowhere in the empire to hide from the wrath of the king. Even now the daggers would be hunting him. "Why you?" Pashad had demanded the previous night. "Why can your God not use someone else? Why must you throw away your life?"
"I do not know, Pashad. What can I say?"
"You can give up this foolishness. We will move to Balakris, put this nonsense behind us."
"It is not nonsense. Without God I am nothing, and the king's evil must be opposed."
"If your Lord Kronos is so powerful, why does he not strike the king dead with a thunderbolt? Why does he need a shipbuilder?"
Nu shrugged. "It is not for me to question him. All I have is his. All the world is his. I have been a temple student all my life, never good enough to be a priest, and I have broken many of his laws. But I cannot refuse when he calls upon me. What kind of a man would I be? Answer me that."
"You would be a life man," she said.
"Away from God there is no life."
He saw the defeat in her dark eyes, saw it born in the bright tears that welled and fell to her cheeks. "What of me and the children? A traitor's wife suffers his fate. Have you thought of that? Do you wish to see your own children burning in the fires?"
"No!"
The word was torn from him in a cry of anguish.
"You must get away from here, beloved. You must. I spoke to Bali this afternoon, and he says you can go to him tomorrow night. He has something for you."
They talked for more than 2 hours, making plans. Then Nu had gone to his tiny prayer room, where he knelt until the dawn. He begged his God to release him, but as the dawn streaked the sky, he knew what he must do. Go to the temple and speak against the king. Now he had, and death awaited him.
"Are you eating or drinking, Highness?"
asked the housekeeper.
"What? Oh, wine, the best you have." "Indeed, Highness."
The man bowed and moved away. Nu did not notice his return, nor the jug and goblet he placed upon the table. The housekeeper cleared his throat, and Nu jerked, then delved into his purse and dropped a large silver coin into the man's hand. The housekeeper counted out Nu's change and placed it on the table. Nu ignored the money and absently poured the wine. It was from the southwest, rich and heady. He drained the goblet and refilled it. 2 daggers moved into sight beyond the window, and the crowd parted for them, people jostling and pushing to avoid contact with the reptiles. Nu averted his eyes and drank some more of the wine. A figure moved into the seat opposite.
"To know the future is to be assured of fortune,"
he said, as he spread out a series of stones on the table.
"I do not need my future read,"
replied Nu. But the seer swept up 2 small silver pieces from the change on the table. Then he scattered the stones.
"Pick 3,
he said. Nu was about to order the man away when the 2 daggers entered the room. He swallowed hard.
"What did you say?"
he asked, turning to face the newcomer.
"Pick 3 stones,"
the seer repeated, and Nu did so, leaning forward so that his hood fell further over his face.
"Now, give me your hand,"
ordered the seer. The man's fingers were long and slender, cold as knife blades as he studied Nu's palm for several seconds.
"You are a strong man, but then I need no special skill to see that,"
he said, grinning. He was young, hawk-faced, with deep-set brown eyes.
"And you are worried?"
"Not at all," whispered Nu.
"Curious," said the man suddenly. "I see a journey, but not over water, nor yet over land. I see a man with lightning in his hands and death in his dark fingers. I see water rising."
Nu wrenched his hand away. "Keep the money," he hissed. He looked into the seer's eyes and saw the fear there.
How does a man travel, and yet not move over land or water? He asked, forcing a smile. What kind of seer are you? A good one, said the man softly. And you can relax, for they have gone. Who? Nu asked, not daring to look up. The reptiles. You are in great danger, my friend. Death stalks you. Death stalks us all, Nu replied. No man avoids him forever. There is truth in that. I do not know where you are going, nor do I want to know, but I see a strange land and a grey rider. His hands hold great power. He is the man of thunder. He is the doom of worlds. I do not know if he is a friend or an enemy, but you are linked to him. Walk warily. Too late for that, said Nu. Will you join me in a drink? Your company is, I think, too perilous for me. Go with God.
Chapter 5. Beth McAdam climbed down from the wagon, gave the broken wheel a hard kick, and cursed long and fluently. Her 2 children sat in amused silence on the tailboard. "Wouldn't you just know it?" said Beth. The wooden rim had split and torn free the metal edge. She kicked it again. Samuel tried to stifle the giggle with his fist, but it exploded from him in a high peal. Beth stormed round to the rear of the wagon, but the boy squirmed up over the piled furniture where she could not reach him. "You little snapper gut!" she yelled. Then Mary began to laugh, and Beth swung on her. "You think it's funny to be trapped out here with the wolves and the enormous lions?" Mary's face fell, and Beth was instantly contrite. "I'm sorry, honey. Oh, there ain't no lions. I was only joking." "You promise?" said Mary, gazing out over the plain. "I do. And even if there was, he'd know better than to come anywhere near your ma when she's angry. And you come down from there, Samuel, or I'll rip out your arms and feed 'em to the wolves." His blond head peeped over the chest of drawers. "You ain't going to whack me, Ma?" "I ain't going to whack you, snapper gut. Help Mary get the pots unloaded. We're going to have to camp here and figure a way to mend the wagon." While the children busied themselves preparing a campfire, Beth sat on a boulder and stared hard at the wheel. They would need to unload everything, then try to lever up the empty wagon while she manhandled the spare wheel into place. She was sure she could do it, but could the children handle the lever? Samuel was big for a 7-year-old, but he lacked the concentration necessary for such a task, and Mary, at 8, was wand-thin and would never muster the power needed. But there had to be a way. There always was. 10 years ago, when her mother was beaten to death by a drunken father, the 12-year-old Beth Newson had taken a carving knife and cut his throat in his sleep. Then, with 7 silver barter coins, she'd walked 70 miles to Seeker settlement and spun a terrible tale of brigands and killers raiding the farm. For 3 years the committee made her live with Seth Reed and his wife, and she was treated like a slave. At 15, she'd set her cap at the powerful logger Sean McAdam. The poor man had no chance against her wide blue eyes, long blonde hair, and hip-swinging walk. Beth Newson was no beauty, with her heavy brows and large nose, but by heaven she knew what to do with what God had given her. Sean McAdam fell like a poleaxed bull, and they were wed 3 months later. 7 months after that, Mary had been born, and a year later, Samuel. Last fall, Sean had decided to move his family south, and they'd purchased a wagon from Mynheer Grimm and set off with high hopes. But the first town they reached had been hit by the Red Death. They'd left swiftly, but within days Sean's huge body had been covered with red, weeping sores. The glands under his arms swelled, and all movement brought pain. They had camped in a high meadow, and Beth tended him day and night. But despite his awesome strength, Sean McAdam lost the fight for life and Beth buried him on the hillside. Before they could move on, Samuel was struck down by the illness. Exhausted, Beth continued to nurse the boy, going without sleep and sitting by his bedside, dabbing at the sores with a damp cloth. The child had pulled through, and within 2 weeks the sores had vanished. Without the strength of Sean McAdam, the family had pushed on, through snow and ice, through spring floods, and once across a narrow cliff trail under threat of avalanche. Beth had twice driven wolves from the 6 oxen, shooting one great beast dead with a single shot from Sean's double-barrelled flintlock. Samuel's pride in his mother's achievement was colossal. 5 days ago he found another source of pride when 2 brigands had accosted them on the road, sour-looking men, bearded and eagle-eyed. Beth laid down the reins and took up the flintlock pistol. "Now, you scum-tars don't look too bright to me, so I'll speak slow. Give me the road, or by God, I'll send your pitiful souls straight to hell." And they had. One even swept his hat from his head in an elaborate bow as she passed. Beth smiled at the memory now, then returned her gaze to the wheel. 2 problems faced her. 1, finding a length of wood to use as a lever, and 2, figuring out how to do both jobs, levering and fitting the wheel, herself. Mary brought her some soup. It was thin but nourishing. Samuel made her a cup of herb tea. There was too much sugar in it, but she thanked him with a bright smile and ruffled his hair. "You're a pair of good kids," she said. "For a pair of snapper-guts, that is." "Ma, riders come in," cried Mary, and Beth stood and drew the flintlock from her wide belt. She eased back the hammers and hid the weapon in the fold of her long woolen skirt. Her blue eyes narrowed as she took in the 6 men, and she swallowed hard, determined to show no fear. "Wait in the wagon," she told the children. "Do it now." They scrambled up the tailboard and hid behind the chest. Beth walked forward, her eyes moving from man to man, seeking the leader. He rode at the centre of the group, a tall, thin-faced rider with short-cropped grey hair and a red scar running from brow to chin. Beth smiled up at him. "Will you not step down, sir?" she asked. The men chuckled, but she ignored them, keeping her eyes fixed to Scarface. "Oh, we'll step down right enough," he said. "I'll step down into hell for a woman with a body like yours." Lifting his leg over the saddle pommel, he slid to the ground and advanced on her. Taking a swift step forward, she curled her left arm up over his shoulder, drawing him down to a passionate kiss. At the same time, her right hand slid up between them, and the cold barrels of the flintlock pressed into his groin. Beth moved her head so that her mouth was close to his ear. "What you are feeling, Pig-Breath, is a gun," she whispered. "Now, tell your men to change the wheel on the wagon and touch nothing in it." "Ain't you going to share her, Harry?" called one rider. For a moment Scarface toyed with the idea of making a grab for the pistol, but he glanced down into Beth's steely blue eyes and changed his mind. "We'll talk about it later, Quint," he said. "First, you boys change that wheel." "Change? We didn't ride in here to change no damn wheel," roared Quint. "Do it," hissed Scarface, "or I'll rip your guts out." The men swung down from their mounts and set to work, 4 of them taking the weight of the wagon, and the 5th, Quint, hammering loose the wheel pin and manhandling the broken wheel free. Beth walked Scarface to the edge of the camp, where she ordered him to sit on a round boulder. She sat to the right of him, leaving his body between her and the working men. Out of sight, the flintlock remained pressed now to his ribs. "You're a smart bitch," said Scarface, "and, except for that big nose, a pretty one. Would you really shoot me?" "Sooner than spit," she assured him. "Now, when those men have finished their chore, you'll send them back to wherever your camp is. Am I making myself clear, Dungbrain?" "It's done, Harry. Now, do we get down to it?" called Quint. "Ride back to the camp.
I'll see you there in a couple of hours." "Now, wait a goddamn minute. You ain't keeping the order yourself. No ways!"
Quint turned to look to the others for support, but the men shifted nervously. Then 2 of them mounted their horses, and the others followed.
"Damn it, Harry, it ain't fair,"
protested Quint, but he backed to his mount and stepped into the saddle nevertheless. As they rode from the camp, Beth lifted the heavy pistol from the scabbard at Scarface's hip. Then she stood and moved away from him. The children climbed out of the wagon.
"What are you going to do now, Ma?" asked Samuel. "You going to kill him?"
Beth passed the brigand's gun to Mary. It was a cap-and-ball percussion revolver. "Get them pliers and pull off the brass caps, girl," she said. Mary carried the gun to the wagon and opened the toolbox. One by one she stripped the caps from the weapon, then returned it to her mother. Beth threw it to Scarface, and he caught it deftly and slid it home in its scabbard. "Now what?" he asked. "Now we wait for a while, and then you go back to your men." "You think I won't come back?" "You'll think about it," she admitted. "Then you'll realise just how they'll laugh when you tell 'em I held a gun to your instrument and forced you to mend my wagon. No, you'll tell 'em I was one hell of a lay and you let me ride on." "They'll be fighting mad," he said. Then he grinned. "Sweet Jesus, but you're a woman worth fighting over. Where are you headed?" "Pilgrim's Valley," she told him. There was no point in lying. The wagon tracks would be easy to follow. "See those peaks yonder? Cut to right of them. There's a trail there. It's high and narrow, but it'll save you 4 days. You can't miss it. A long time ago someone placed out a stone arrow and cut signs into trees. Follow it through, and you'll find Pilgrim's Valley in around 2 days beyond." "I might just take your advice, Harry," she said. "Mary, prepare some herb tea for our guest, but don't get too close to him. I'd like a clear shot, if necessary." Mary stoked up the fire and boiled a kettle of water. She asked Harry if he took sugar, added 3 measures, and then carried a steaming mug to within 6 feet of him. "Put it on the ground," ordered Beth. Mary did so, and Harry moved to it cautiously. He sipped the tea slowly. "If I'm ever in Pilgrim's Valley, would you object if I called on you?" Harry asked. "Ask me when you see me in Pilgrim's Valley," she told him. "Who would I ask for?" "Beth McAdam." "Greatly pleased to meet you, ma'am. Harry Cooper is my name, late of Allion and points north." He went to his horse and mounted. Beth watched as he rode east, then uncocked the flintlock. Harry rode the 4 miles to the camp, his mind aflame with thoughts of the spirited woman. He saw the campfire and cantered in, ready with his tale of satisfied lust. Taking his horse to the picket line, he walked to the fire. Something struck him in the back, and he heard the thunder of a shot. He swung, dragging his pistol clear and cocking it. Quint rose from behind a bush and shot him a 2nd time in the chest. Harry levelled his own gun, but the hammer clicked down on the empty nipple. 2 more shots punched him from his feet, and he fell back into the fire which blazed around his hair. "Now," said Quint, "now we all share." Chapter 6. Nu Khesisatra eased his huge frame into the shadows of a doorway, pulling his dark cloak over his head and holding his breath. His fear rose, and he could feel his heart beating in his chest. A cloud obscured the moon, and the burly shipbuilder welcomed the darkness. The daggers were patrolling the streets, and if he was caught, he would be dragged to the prison buildings at the centre of the city and tortured. He would be dead by the dawn, his head impaled on a spike above the gates. Nu shivered. The sound of distant thunder rumbled above the city of Ad, and a jagged spear of lightning threw momentary shadows across the cobbled street. Nu waited for several seconds, calming himself. His faith had carried him this far, but his courage was near exhausted. "Be with me, Lord Kronos," he prayed. "Strengthen my failing limbs." He stepped out onto the street, ears straining for any sound that might warn him of the approach of the daggers. He swallowed hard. The night was silent, the curfew complete. He moved on as silently as he could until he reached Barley's high-towered home. The gate was locked, and he waited in the shadows, watching the moon rise. At the prearranged hour, he heard the bolts slide open. Stepping into the courtyard beyond, he sank to a seat as his friend shut the gate, locking it tight. Barley touched a finger to his lips and led the dark-cloaked New into the house. The shutters were closed, and curtains had been hung over the windows. Barley lit a lantern and placed it on an oval table.
"Peace be upon this house,"
said New. The smaller Barley nodded his bald head and smiled.
"And the Lord bless my guest and friend," he answered.
The two men sat at the table and drank a little wine. Then Barley leaned back and gazed at his friend of 20 years. New Khasisatra had not changed in that time. His beard was still rich and black, his eyes bright blue and ageless beneath thick jutting brows. Both men had managed to purchase Sipstrasi fragments at least twice to restore youth and health. But Barley had fallen on hard times, his wealth disappearing with the loss in storms at sea of 3 of his prize ships, and now he was beginning to show the signs of age. He appeared to be in his 60s, though he was, in fact, 80 years older than New, who was 110. New had tried to acquire more Sipstrasi, but the king had gathered almost all the stones to himself, and even a fragment would now cost all of New's wealth.
"You must leave the city," Barley said, breaking the silence. "The king has signed a warrant for your immediate arrest." "I know. I was foolish to speak against him in the temple, but I've prayed hard, and I know the Great One was speaking through me. The law of one is no more, my friend. The sons of Belial have the ears of the king." "How is Pashad?" "I ordered her to denounce me this morning and seek the severing of the knot. She at least will be safe, as will my sons." "No one is safe, Nu. No one. The king is insane. The slaughter has begun, even as you prophesied it. There is madness in the streets, and these daggers fill me with terror." "There is worse to come," Nu told him sadly. "In my prayer dreams I have seen terrible sights. 3 suns in the sky at one time, the heavens tearing, the seas rising to swamp the clouds. I know it is close, Barley, and I am powerless to prevent it." "Many men have dreams that do not presage evil days," said Barley. Nu shook his head. "I know this, but my dreams have all come true so far. The Lord of all things is sending these visions. I know he has ordered me to warn the people, and I know also that they will ignore me. But it is not for me to question his purpose."
Barley poured another goblet of wine and said nothing. Nu Khasisatra had always been a man of iron, principles, and faith, devout and honest. Barley liked and respected him. He did not share his principles, but he'd come to know his God, and for that gift alone he would give his life for the shipbuilder. Opening a hidden drawer below the table, he removed a small purse of embroidered deerskin. For a moment he held it, reluctant to part with it. Then he smiled and pushed it across the table. "For you, my friend," he said. Nu picked it up and felt the warmth emanating from within the purse. Then he opened it with trembling fingers and tipped out the stone within. It was not a fragment, but a whole stone, round as if polished, golden with thin black veins. He closed his hand around it, feeling the power surging in him. Gently he placed it on the tabletop and gazed at the bald, elderly man before him. "With this, you could be young again, Barley. You could live for 1,000 years. Why? Why would you give it to me?" "Because you need it, Nu, and because I never had a friend before.
but it is worth perhaps 10 times as much money as is contained in the entire city. Oh, I could not possibly accept it. You must. It is life. The daggers are seeking you, and you know what that means. Torture and death. They have closed the city, and you cannot escape, save by the journey. There is a gateway within the stone circle the princes used to use, to the north of the 7th square. You know it? By the crystal lake? Good. Go there. Use these words and hold the stone high. He passed New a small square of parchment. The enchantment will take you to Balakris. From there you will be on your own. I have funds in Balakris, said Nu, but the Lord wants me to stay and continue to warn the people. You gave me the secret of the Great One, Bali told him, and I accept his will overrides any wishes of our own. But similarly, you have done as he commanded. You gave your warnings, but their ears were closed to you. Added to this, Nu, my friend, I prayed for a way in which I might help you, and now this stone has come into my possession. And, yes, I wanted to keep it, but the Great One touched me and let me know it was for you. How did you come by it? An Achaean trader brought it to my shop. He thought it was a gold nugget and wished to sell it to me in return for the money to buy a new sail. A sail? With this you could buy 1,000 sails, perhaps more. I told him it was worth half the price of a sail, and he sold it to me for 60 pieces of silver. Bali shrugged. It was with such dealings that I first became rich. You must go now. The daggers surely know we are friends. Come with me, Bali, Nu urged. With this stone we could reach my new ship. We could sail far from the reach of the king and his daggers. No, my place is here. My life is here. My death will be here. Bali rose and led the way to the gate. One thing more, he told his friend as they stood in the moonlight. Last night, as I held the stone, I had a strange dream. I saw a man in golden armor. He came to me and sat beside me. He gave me a message for you. He said, you must seek the sword of God. Does it mean anything to you? Nothing. Did you recognize him? No. His face shone like the sun, and I could not look at him. The Great One will make it plain to me, said Nu as he reached out to embrace the smaller man. May he watch over you, Bali. And you, my friend. Bali silently opened the gate and peered out into the shadows. It's clear, he whispered. Go quickly. Nu embraced him once more, then stepped into the shadows and was gone. Bali rebolted the gate and returned to his room, where he sank into his chair and tried to repress his regrets. With the stone he could have rebuilt his empire and enjoyed eternal youth. Without it, penury and death. He moved back into the main house, stepping over the body of the Achaean sailor who'd brought him the stone. Bali had not even possessed the 60 pieces of silver the man had requested, but he still owned a knife with a sharp blade. The sound of crashing timber caused him to spin and run back towards the garden. He arrived to see the gate on its hinges and 3 dark-armoured daggers moving towards him, their reptilian eyes gleaming in the moonlight, their scaled skin glistening. What do you want?" asked Bali, trembling.
"Where is he?"
"Who?" 2 of the daggers moved around the garden, sucking the air through their slitted nostrils.
"He was here,"
hissed one of them, and Bali backed away. One of the daggers lifted a strangely shaped club from a scabbard at his side, pointing it at the little trader.
"Last chance. Where is he?"
"Where you will never find him," said Bali,
and drawing his knife, he leapt at the dagger. A sound like thunder came from the small club in the reptile's hand, and a hammer smote Barley in the chest. The little man was hurled on his back to the path, where he lay sprawled, staring sightlessly up at the stars. A second shot sounded, and the dagger pitched to the ground, a black hole in his wedge-shaped head. The other creature spun to see the golden-haired woman, Shahrazad.
"I want Barley alive," she said softly, "and my orders will be obeyed."
Behind her, a dozen more daggers crowded into the garden.
"Search the house," she ordered. "Rip it apart. If Nukazisatra escapes, I will see you all flayed alive."
Chapter 7. Of all the seasons God had granted, it was the spring that Shannow loved above others, with its heady music of life and growth, its chorus of bird-song, and richly coloured flowers pushing back the snow. The air, too, was clean, and a man could drink it in like wine, filling his lungs with the essence of life itself. Shannow dismounted before the crest of a hill and walked to the summit, gazing out over the rippling grass of the plain. Then he squatted on the ground and scanned the rolling lands before him. In the far distance he could see a wandering herd of cattle, and to the west several mountain sheep grazing on a hillside. He moved back from the skyline and studied the back trail through the mountain valley, memorizing the jagged peaks and the narrow ways he had passed. He did not expect to return this way, but if he did, he needed to be sure of his bearings. He unbuckled the thick belt which carried his gun scabbards and removed his heavy topcoat, then swung the guns around his hips once more and buckled the belt in place before rolling his coat and tying it behind his saddle. The stallion was contentedly cropping grass, and Shannow loosened the saddle cinch. Taking his Bible, he sat with his back to a boulder, slowly reading the story of King Saul. He always found it hard to avoid sympathizing with the first king of Israel. The man had fought hard and well to make the nation strong, only to have a usurper preparing to steal his crown. Even at the end, when God deserted him, Saul still fought gallantly against the enemy and died alongside his sons in a great battle. Shannow closed the book and took a long, cool drink from his canteen. His wounds were almost healed now, and last night he'd cut the stitches with the blade of his hunting knife. Although he could not yet move his right arm with customary speed, his strength was returning. He tightened the saddle and rode out onto the plain. Here and there were the tracks of horses, cattle, and deer. He rode warily, watching the horizon, constantly hitching himself in the saddle to study the trail behind. The plain stretched on endlessly, and the far blue mountains to the south seemed small and insubstantial. A bird suddenly flew up to Shannow's left. His eyes fastened to it, and he realized that he was following its flight with the barrel of his pistol. The weapon was cocked and ready. He eased the hammer back into place and sheathed the gun. A long time ago he would have been delighted with the speed at which he reacted to possible danger, but bitter experience had long since corroded his pride. He'd been attacked outside Alien by several men and had killed them all. Then a sound from behind had caused him to swivel and fire, and he had killed a child who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That child would have been a grown man by now, with children of his own. A farmer, a builder, a preacher? No one would ever know. Shannow tried to push the memory from his mind, but it clung to him with talons of fire.
"Who would want to be you, Shannow?"
he asked himself.
"Who would want to be the Jerusalem man?"
The children of Alien had followed him during his nightly tours, copying the smooth, straight-backed walk. They carried wooden guns thrust in their belts, and they worshipped him. They thought it wonderful to be so respected and feared, to have a name that travelled the land ahead of you.
"Is it wonderful, Shannow?"
The people of Albion had been grateful when John Shannow put the brigands to flight, or buried them. But when the town was clean, they'd paid him and asked him to move on. And the brigands returned, as they always did. And perhaps the children followed them around, copying their walks and fighting pretend battles with their wooden guns.
"How far to Jerusalem, Shannow?"
"Over the next mountain," he answered aloud. The stallion's ears pricked up and he snorted. Shannow chuckled as he patted the beast's neck and urged him into a run over the level ground. It was not a sensible move, he knew. A rabbit hole or a loose rock could cause the horse to stumble and break a leg, or throw a shoe. But the wind in his face felt good, and life was never without perils. He let the horse have his head for about half a mile, then drew back on the reins as he saw wagon tracks. They were fresh, maybe 2 days old. Shannow dismounted and examined them. The wheels had bit deep into the dry earth. A family moving south with all their possessions. Silently he wished them good fortune and remounted. By mid-afternoon he came upon the broken wheel. By now he knew a little of the family. There were 2 children and a woman. The children had gathered sticks and dried cattle droppings for fuel, probably depositing them in a net slung under the tailboard. The woman had walked beside the lead oxen. Her feet were small, but her stride long. There was no sign of a man, but then, thought Shannow, perhaps he is lazy and rides in the wagon. The broken wheel, though, was a mystery. Shannow studied the tracks of the horsemen. They'd ridden to the camp and changed the wheel, then returned the way they had come. The woman had stood close to one of the riders, and they'd walked together to a boulder. By the wagon tracks, Shannow found 6 brass caps, still with their fulminates intact. At some time during the encounter, someone had unloaded a pistol. Why? He built a fire on the ashes of the old one and sat pondering the problem. Perhaps the caps were old, and the woman, for he knew now there was no man with them, had doubted their effectiveness. But if the caps were old, then so would be the wads and charges, and these had not been stripped clear. He read the track signs once more, but could make no more of them, save that one of the horsemen had ridden to the right of the main group, or had left at a different time. Shannow walked out along the trail, and 100 paces from the camp he saw a hoof-print from the lone horse, which had overstamped a previous print. So then, the lone rider had left after the main group. He had obviously sat talking with the woman. Why did they not all stay? He prepared himself some tea and ate the last of the fruit from Sheeran's store. As he delved at the bottom of the sack, his fingers touched something cold and metallic, and he drew it out. It was like a coin, but made of gold, and upon the surface was a raised motif that Shannow could not make out in the gathering dusk. He tucked the coin into his pocket and settled down beside the fire. But the tracks had disturbed him, and sleep would not come. The moon was bright, and he rose, saddled the stallion, and rode off after the horsemen. When he came to their campsite, they were gone, but a man lay with his head in the ashes of a dead fire, his face burned. He'd been shot several times, and his boots and gun were missing, though the belt and scabbard remained. Shannow was about to return to his horse when he heard a groan. He could hardly believe life still survived in that ruined body. Unhooking his canteen from the saddle, he knelt by the man, lifting the burned head. The man's eyes opened.
"They're gone after the woman," he whispered.
Shannow held the canteen to his lips, but he choked and could not swallow. He said no more, and Shannow waited for the inevitable. The man died within minutes. Something glinted to Shannow's right. Under a bush, where it must have fallen, lay the man's gun. Shannow retrieved it. The caps had been removed. He had no chance to defend himself against the attack. Shannow pondered the evidence. The men were obviously brigands who'd shot down one of their own. Why? Over the woman? But they'd all been at the camp. Why leave? A group of men had come across a woman and 2 children by a wagon with a broken wheel. They'd mended the wheel and left, save one who followed after. His pistol had been tampered with, but then, surely he would have known that. When he arrived, his friends had shot him. Then they had headed back to the woman. There was no sense in it. Unless he had stopped them from taking the woman in the first place. But then, why would he unload his gun before returning? There was only one way to find out. Shannow stepped into the saddle and searched for the tracks. "Why did God kill my dad?" asked Samuel, as he dipped his flat baked bread in the last of his broth. Beth put aside her own plate and looked across the campfire at the boy, his face white in the moonlight, his blonde hair shining like silver threads. "God didn't kill him, Sam. The red fever done that. But the preacher used to say that nobody died unless God wanted them to. Then they went to heaven or hell." "That's what the preacher believes," she said slowly. "But it don't necessarily mean it's true. The preacher used to say that holy Jesus died less than 400 years ago, and then the world toppled. But your dad didn't believe that, did he? He said there were thousands of years between then and now. You remember?" "Maybe that's why God killed him," said Samuel, "'cause he didn't believe the preacher." "Ain't nothing in life that easy," Beth told him. "There's wicked men that God don't kill, and there's good men, like your pa, who die out of their time. That's just life, Samuel. It don't come with no promises." Mary, who had said nothing throughout, cleared away the dishes, carrying them beyond the campsite and scrubbing them with grass. Beth stood and stretched her back. "You've a lot still to learn, Samuel," she said. "You want something, then you have to fight for it. You don't give ground, and you don't whinge and whine. You take your knocks, and you get on with living. Now, help your sister clear up, and put that fire out." "But it's cold, Ma," Samuel protested. "Couldn't we just sleep out here with the fire?" "The fire can be seen for miles. You want them raiders coming back?" "But they helped us with the wheel." "Put out the fire, snap-a-gut!" she stormed, and the boy leapt to his feet and began to kick earth over the blaze. Beth walked away to the wagon and stood staring out over the plain. She didn't know if there was a God, and she didn't care. God had not helped her mother against the brutality of the man she married, and, sure as sin, God had never helped her. Such a shame, she thought. It would have been nice to feel her children were safe under the security of a benign deity, with the faith that all their troubles could be safely left to a supreme being. She remembered the terrible beating her mother had suffered the day she died, could still hear the awful sounds of fists on flesh. She'd watched as he dragged her body out to the waste ground behind the house, and listened as the spade bit into the earth for an unmarked grave. He staggered back into the house and stared at her, his hands filthy and his eyes red-streaked. Then he had drunk himself into a stupor and fallen asleep in the heavy chair. "Just you and me now," he mumbled. The carving knife had slid across his throat, and he had died without waking. Beth shook her head and stared up at the stars, her eyes misting with unaccustomed tears. She glanced back at the children as they spread their blankets on the warm ground beside the dead fire. Sean McAdam had not been a bad man, but she did not miss him as they did. He had learned early on that his wife did not love him, but he doted on his children, played with them, taught them, helped them. So devoted had he been that he had not noticed his wife's affection growing, not until close to the end, when he had lain almost paralyzed in the wagon. "Sorry, Beth," he whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for. Rest and get well." For an hour or more he had slept, then his eyes opened and his hand trembled and lifted from the blanket. She took hold of it, squeezing it firmly. "I love you," he said. "God's truth." She stared at him hard. "I know. Sleep. Go to sleep." "I didn't do too bad by you and the kids, did I?" "Stop talking like that," she ordered. "You'll feel better in the morning." He shook his head. "It's over, Beth. I'm hanging by a thread. Tell me, please." "Tell you what?" "Just tell me." His eyes closed and his breathing became shallow. She held his hand to her breast and leaned in close. "I love you, Sean. I do. God knows I do. Now, please get well." He had slipped away in the night while the children were sleeping. Beth sat with him for some time, but then considered the effect on the children of seeing their father's corpse. So she had dragged the body from the wagon and dug a grave on the hillside while they slept. Lost in her memories now, she did not hear Mary approach. The child laid her hand on her mother's shoulder, and Beth turned and instinctively took her in her arms. "Don't fret, Mary, my love. Nothing's going to happen." "I miss my pa. I wish we were still back home." "I know," said Beth, stroking the child's long auburn hair, "but if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. We just gotta move on." She pushed the girl from her. "Now, it's important you remember what I showed you today, and do it. There's no telling how many bad men there are twixt here and Pilgrim's Valley. And I need you, Mary. Can I trust you?" "Sure you can, Ma. Good girl. Now get to bed." Beth stayed awake for several hours, listening to the wind over the grass of the plain, watching the stars gliding by. 2 hours before dawn she woke Mary. "Don't fall asleep, girl. You watch for any riders, and wake me if you see 'em." Then she lay down and fell into a dreamless sleep. It seemed to last for only a few moments before Mary was shaking her, but the sun was clearing the eastern horizon as Beth blinked and pushed one hand through her blonde hair. "Riders, Ma. I think it's the same men." "Get in the wagon, and remember what I told you." Beth lifted the flintlock pistol and cocked both barrels. Then she hid the gun once more in the folds of her skirt and scanned the group for sign of Harry. He wasn't with them. She took a deep breath and steadied herself as the horseman thundered into the camp, and the man she remembered as Quint leapt from the saddle.
"Now, missy," he said, "we'll have a little of what old Harry enjoyed."
Beth raised the flintlock. Quint stopped in his tracks. She loosed the first barrel, and the ball took Quint just above his nose, ploughing through his skull. He fell back into the dust with blood pumping from a fatal wound in his head as Beth stepped forward. The sudden explosion had alarmed the horses, and the 4 remaining riders fought to settle them as Quint's mount galloped out over the plain. In the silence that followed, the men glanced at one another. Beth's voice cut into them. "You horsens have 2 choices, ride or die, and make the choice fast. I start shooting when I stop speaking." The gun rose and pointed at the nearest man. "Whoa there, lady!" the rider shouted. "I'm leaving." "You can't take us, old bitch," shouted another, spurring his horse. But a tremendous explosion came from the wagon, and the brigand was whipped from the saddle, half his head blown away. "Any other doubters?" asked Beth. "Move!" The 3 survivors dragged on the reins and galloped away. Beth ran to the wagon, took her powder horn, and reloaded the flintlock. Mary climbed down from the tailboard with the shortened rifle in her arms. "You did well, Mary," said Beth, ramming home the wad over the ball and charge. "I'm proud of you." She took the rifle and leaned it against the wagon, then cradled the trembling child in her arms. There, it's all right. Go and sit at the front. Don't look at 'em." Beth guided Mary to the driving platform and helped her up, then walked back to the bodies. Unbuckling Quint's pistol belt, she strapped it to her own waist, and then searched the body for powder and ammunition. She found a small hide sack of caps and transferred them to the wagon, then took a second pistol from the other body and hid it behind the driver's seat. Sean McAdam had never been able to afford a revolving pistol. Now they had two. Beth gathered the oxen, hitched them to the wagon, and then walked to the brigand's horse, a bay mare, and pulled herself into the saddle. Awkwardly, she rode alongside where Mary sat. "Take up the reins, child, and let's move." Samuel clambered up behind Mary and grinned at his mother. "You look just like a brigand, Ma." Beth smiled back at him, then transferred her gaze to Mary, who was sitting white-faced, staring ahead. "Take the reins, Mary, goddammit!" The girl flinched and unhooked them from the brake. "Now, let's go." Mary flicked the reins, and Beth rode up alongside the lead ox and whacked her palm across its rump. High above, the carrion birds had begun to circle. Chapter 8. Nu Khasisatra reached the old stone circle an hour before dawn. He waited, hidden in the trees, searching for any guards who might be patrolling here, but there were none that he could see. Under the bright moonlight, he studied the words on the parchment, memorizing them. Then, stone in hand, he ran from the trees onto the open ground before the circle. At once there was a thin, piercing whistle. Shadows darted for him, and a woman's voice cried out, "Alive! Take him alive!" Nu sprinted for the stone circle, its tall grey slabs promising sanctuary. A reptilian figure in black armour ran into his path, but Nu swung his huge fist into the creature's face, dashing him to the grass. Hurdling the falling body, he made it to the shadows of the stones. Once there, he swung to see more daggers closing on him. He lifted his hand. "Barak Naize Torlemes," he shouted. Lightning flashed across his eyes, blinding him, and his mind was filled with whirling colours. All sense of weight and strength left him, and he tumbled like a wind-blown feather into a storm. With a sickening lurch, he felt the ground under his feet, stumbled, and fell. His eyes opened, but at first he could see nothing save flickering lights. Then his vision cleared, and he found himself in a small clearing. Close by was a dead man, his face hideously burnt. Nu got to his feet and moved to the body. The man was wearing strange apparel, and he studied it. The clothing was unlike anything he had encountered. He walked out of the clearing and stared at the surrounding landscape. There was no city of Balakris, no view of a distant ocean. Grasslands drifted to a blurred horizon where jagged mountains soared to meet the sky. Returning to the clearing, Nu sat and examined his stone. The black veins in the gold had swelled. He had no way of knowing how much power the journey had sucked from the Sipstrassi. Moving to his knees, Nu Khasisatra began to pray. For some time he gave thanks for his deliverance from the hands of Shahrazad and her daggers. Then he asked for his family to be protected. Finally, he sought the silence in which the voice of God could be heard. The wind whispered about him, but he heard no words within it. Sunlight bathed his face, but no visions came. At last he stood. It would be safer, he knew, if his clothing matched that of the people of this land. The stone glowed warm in his hands, and his robes and cloak shimmered and changed. Now he was wearing trousers and boots, shirt, and a long jacket identical to those of the dead man. "Be careful, Nu," he warned himself. "Do not waste the power." He recalled the words of Bali, "Seek the sword of God." He had no idea in which direction to travel, but looking down at the ground he saw the tracks of a horse heading towards the mountains. With no other omen to guide him, Nu Khasisatra followed them. Shahrazad sat at an ornate table, her ice-blue eyes locked to the face of Pashad, wife of the traitor Nu Khasisatra.
"You denounced your husband yesterday. Why?"
"I discovered he was plotting against the king," she answered, averting her eyes and gazing at the surface of the desk, on which lay a curious white-handled ornament of silver.
"With whom was he plotting?"
"The merchant Bali, Highness. He was the only one I knew."
"You know that the family of a traitor shares his sentence,"
whispered the golden-haired inquisitor, and Pashad nodded.
"Yet he had not been declared a traitor when I denounced him, Highness. Also, I am no longer of his family, for after denouncing him, I divorced him." "So you did. Where is he hiding?"
"I do not know, Highness. The list of our property was taken this morning. There are only 5 houses and 3 store buildings by the dock. Other than that, I cannot help you." Shahrazad smiled. Then, reaching into the pocket of her pearl-embroidered tunic, she drew out a red gold stone and placed it upon the desk. 3 words of power she uttered.
"Place your hand over the stone,"
she told the slim, dark-haired girl before her. Pashad did so.
"Now I will ask you some more questions, but I want you to be aware that if you lie, the stone will kill you instantly. Do you understand this?"
Pashad nodded, but her eyes showed her fear.
"Do you know the whereabouts of the man Nu Khasisatra?"
"I do not."
"Do you know the names of any of his friends who may have been involved in the plot?"
"That is difficult to answer," said Pashad, sweat glistening on her brow. "I know some of his friends, but I would have no way of knowing whether they shared his treason."
"Do you share his treason?"
"No, I do not understand any of it. How can I tell if the king is a god? My life has been spent in making my husband happy and raising his children. What should it matter to us whether the king is a god or not?"
"If you did know the whereabouts of the man Nu Khasisatra, would you tell me?"
"Yes," answered Pashad, "instantly." Shahrazad's surprise was genuine. Lifting Pashad's hand, she took the stone and replaced it in her pocket.
"You are free to go," she said. "If you hear any news of the traitor, then make sure I know of it."
"I will, Highness." Shahrazad watched the woman leave and then leaned back in her chair. A curtain by the left wall parted, and a young man stepped through, tall and wide-shouldered, yet slim of hip. He grinned and sat down in a nearby chair, lifting his booted foot to rest on the table.
"You owe me," he said. "I told you she would know nothing." "Always so smug, Rudiol," she snapped. "But I am somewhat taken aback. For all I have heard of this shipbuilder, he adored his wife. I would have expected him to have taken her into his confidence."
"He's a careful man. Have you any idea where he's gone?"
"Yes," she said, smiling. "As a matter of fact, I have. You see, the circle has been linked to the world we discovered 2 months ago. Nu Khasisatra thought he was escaping, but instead he has travelled to our latest field of conquest. It is the land that has brought us these strange weapons."
She lifted the pistol from the desktop and tossed it to Rodiel. It was silver-plated with grips of carved white bone.
"The king wishes you to become proficient with these guns."
"Will he equip an army with them?"
"No, the king believes them to be vulgar. But my daggers will prove their potency in war."
Rodiel nodded. "And Nu Khasisatra?"
"He's stranded in that strange land. He does not speak the language, nor does he know a way back. I will find him."
"So sure of yourself, Shahrazad? Beware."
Do not mock me, Rodiol. If I am arrogant, it is with good cause. The king knows my talents.
We all know your talents, dear Scheherazade. Some of us have even enjoyed them. But the king is right. These weapons are vulgar beyond description. There's no honour in dispatching an enemy with such a monstrosity.
You fool! You think there is more honour in an arrow or a lance? They are merely weapons of death.
A clever man can dodge an arrow, Scheherazade, or sidestep a lance. But with these, death strikes a man unawares, and their mastery takes no skill. He walked to the window and stepped out into the courtyard beyond. 2 prisoners were tied to stakes. Wood had been piled around their feet and legs. "Where is the skill?" asked Rodiol, cocking the pistol smoothly. 2 shots rang out, and the victims at the stakes sagged against their ropes. All a man needs is a good eye and a swift hand. But with a sword, there are over 40 different variations on the classic block and riposte. 60, if you count the sabre. But if it is the king's wish, I will learn how to handle the thing.
It is the king's wish, Rodiol. Perhaps you will be able to polish your skills in my new world. There are men there who are legends because of their skill with such weapons. I will hunt them down for you and have them brought back for your education." "How sweet of you, Scheherazade. I will look forward to it. Can you give me a name to disturb my dreams?" "There are several. Johnson is one, Crow another. Then there is Daniel Cade. But above them all there is a man called John Shannow. They say he seeks a mythical city, and they call him the Jerusalem Man."
"Bring 'em all, Scheherazade. Since our conquests in the north, we've been sadly lacking in good sport." Chapter 9. Shannow knew from the moment he set off in pursuit that he would be too late to help the woman and her family, and anger burned in him. Even so he rode with care, for in the light of the moon he could not clearly see the ground ahead. It was dawn before he came upon the bodies. They had been disturbed by carrion-eaters, the faces and hands stripped of flesh. Shannow sat his horse and stared down at them. His respect for the unknown woman soared. Dismounting, he examined the ground, finding the spot from which Beth McAdam had fired. Judging by the angle at which the other corpse lay, the second shot must have come from the wagon. Shannow remounted and headed towards the mountains. The land rose sharply, becoming thickly wooded with towering pine. The stallion was tired and stumbled twice. Shannow stepped down and led the horse up and into the trees. They came to a crest on the mountainside, and Shannow gazed down on a sprawling camp with 6 fires and a dozen tents. Men were working under torchlight in an immense pit, from which jutted a towering structure of metal, almost triangular, but with one side slightly curved. There was a wide stream to the south of the camp, and beside it a wagon. The Jerusalem man led his mount down into the campsite, tethering him at a picket line and removing the saddle. A man approached him. "You got word from Skazy?" the man asked, and Shannow turned. "No, I've just come from the north." The man swore and walked away. Shannow made his way to the largest tent and stepped into the lantern-lit interior. There were a dozen or so men inside, eating and drinking, while a large-boned, well-fleshed woman in a leather apron was ladling food into round wooden bowls. He joined the queue and took a bowl of thick broth and a chunk of black bread, carrying it to a bench table near the tent opening. 2 men made room for him, and he ate in silence. "Looking for work?" asked a man across the table, and Shannow looked up. The speaker was around 30 years of age, slender and fair-haired. "No, thank you. I'm heading south," Shannow replied. "Can I purchase supplies here?" You could see Deaker. He may have some spare. He is on site at the moment. He should be in any time now.
What are you working on?
It's an old metal building from before the fall. We've found some interesting artifacts. Nothing of great value yet, but we're hopeful. It has given us great insight into the dark times. They must have been living in fear to build such a great iron fortress here.
Why in fear?
Shannow asked. Oh, you can only see a section of the building from here. It goes on and on. There are no windows or doors for over 100 feet from the foundation base. And then, when you do find them, they are too small to allow anyone to climb through. They must have had terrible wars in those days. Oh, by the way, my name is Klaus Monet. The young man thrust out his hand, and Shannow accepted the grip.
John Shannow,
he said, watching for any response. There was none. And another thing, Monet went on, it is all built of iron, and yet there are no significant iron ore deposits in these mountains, nor trace of any mines, save the silver mines at Pilgrim's Valley. So the inhabitants must have carted ore right across the big Wide. Incredible, isn't it?
Incredible,
agreed Shannow, finishing his meal and rising. Outside the tent he walked to the edge of the pit and watched the men below. They were finishing their work and packing their tools away. He waited until they reached the upper level.
"Mynheer Deaker,"
Shannow called.
"Who wants him?"
asked a thick-set man with a black and silver beard.
"I do. I'm looking to buy some supplies. Grain, dried fruit, and meat. And some oats, if you have them."
"For how many?"
"Just myself."
The man nodded.
"I think I can accommodate you, but Pilgrim's Valley is only 2 days away. You get better prices there." "Always take food where you can find it,"
Shannow said.
"There's wisdom in that,"
Deaker agreed. He led Shannow to the store tents and filled several small sacks.
"You want sugar and salt?" "If you can spare it." "How long have you been working on this site?"
"About a month."
"Oh, it's one of the best. There will be a lot of answers here, mark my words." "And you think it is a building?"
"What else can it be?" asked Deaker with a broad grin.
"It is a ship,"
Shannow told him.
"I like a man with a sense of humour, mynheer. I estimate that it is over 300 feet long, most of it still buried, and it is made of iron. Did you ever see anyone float a piece of iron?"
"No, but I have seen an iron ship before, and considerably bigger than this one."
Deaker shook his head. "I am an arcanist, mynheer. I know my business. I also know you do not get ships at the centre of a landmass. That will be 3 full silvers."
Shannow said no more, but paid for the food with barter coins and carried it back to his saddle, stowing it in his cavernous bags. Then he walked back through the camp towards the wagon by the stream. He saw a woman sitting by a blazing fire with her 2 children asleep in blankets by her feet. She looked up as he approached, and he watched her hand slide towards the pistol scabbard on her belt. Beth McAdam looked long at the tall newcomer. His hair was shoulder-length and dark, with silver streaks at the temples, and a white fork at the chin showed in the close-trimmed beard he wore. His face was angular and strong, his blue eyes cold. By his side were 2 pistols in oiled leather scabbards. He sat down opposite her.
"You coped well with a perilous journey. I congratulate you. Very few people would have dared to cross the Big Wide without the protection of a wagon convoy."
"You get straight to it, don't you?" she said.
"I do not understand you."
"Well, I do not need a guide, or a helper, or a man around me. Thank you for your offer, and good night."
"Have I offended you?"
Shannow asked softly, his blue eyes locked to her own. "I don't offend easily. Neither do you, it seems." He scratched at his beard and smiled. In that moment his face lost some of its harshness.
"No, I do not. If you would prefer me to leave, I will do so."
"Help yourself to some tea," she said. "After that, I would like some privacy."
"That is kind of you."
As he leaned forward to lift the kettle, he froze, then stood, turning to face the darkness. Two men walked into the firelight. Beth eased her hand around the butt of a pistol.
Mynheer Shannow, do you have a moment?" asked Klaus Monet. "There is someone I would like you to meet."
He gestured to his companion, a small, balding figure with a sparse white beard.
"This is Boris Heimat. He is a leading arcanist."
The man dropped his head in a short bow and offered his hand. Shannow took it.
"Mynheer Dicker told me of your conversation," said Heimat. "I was fascinated. I have thought for some time that we were studying a vessel of some kind, but it seems so improbable. We have only excavated some 1/5 of the ship. Do you have an explanation as to how it got here?"
"Yes," replied Shannow, "but I fear we are intruding on the lady's privacy."
"Oh, but of course," agreed Heimat. "My apologies, Frey.
Macadam, and Mynheer Shannow was correct. I do not wish the sleep of my children disturbed." The three men bowed and silently left the campsite. Beth watched them vanish into the shadows and then reappear on the torch-lit slopes of the site. She poured herself some tea and sipped it, Shannow's face hovering in her mind. Was he brigand or landsman? She shook her thoughts clear of him. What difference did it make? She would not see him again. Throwing the remains of her tea to the ground, she settled down under her blankets. But sleep did not come easily.
You have to understand, Mynheer Shannow,"
said Boris Heimat with an apologetic smile,
"that Mynheer Dicker is old view. He is a biblical man and believes the world is currently enduring the last days. To him, Armageddon was a reality that began, to the best of our knowledge, 317 years ago. For myself, I am a long-view scholar. It is my belief that we have seen at least 1,000 years of civilization following the death of the man Jesus. That civilization knew wonders that are now lost to us. This find has already cast great doubts on the old view. If it is a ship, the doubts could become certainties."
Shannow sat silently, uncomfortable within the small tent, and acutely aware that the bright lantern was casting shadows on the canvas. He knew he should be in little danger here, but years of being both hunter and hunted left him uneasy when sitting in exposed places.
"I can tell you little, Mynheer," he said. "More than 1,000 miles from here is a tall mountain. High on a ledge there is a rotting vessel of iron, around 1,000 feet long. It was a ship. I learned this from people who lived close by it and knew its history. It seems this landmass was once at the bottom of an ocean, and many ships sank during storms."
"But the ancient cities we have found," questioned Heimat. "There are even ruins less than 2 miles from here. How is it they were built at the bottom of an ocean?"
"I too wondered this. Then I met a man named Samuel Archer, a scholar like yourself. He proved to me that the world had toppled not once, but twice. The cities themselves are indeed ancient, from an empire called Atlantis that sank below the oceans before the time of Christ."
"Revolutionary words, Mynheer. In some areas you could be stoned to death for saying them."
"I am aware of that," said Shannow. "However, when you excavate more of the ship, you will find the great engines that powered it, and a wheelhouse from where it was steered. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to rest."
"A moment, sir," put in Klaus Monet, who had been sitting in silence as the two older men spoke. "Would you stay with us? Become part of the team?"
"I do not think so," answered Shannow, rising.
"It is just that—" Monet looked to the elderly Heimat for support, but the scholar shook his head, and Monet lapsed into embarrassed silence. Shannow stepped from the tent and made his way to his horse. He fed the beast some grain, then spread his blankets on the ground beside it. He could have told them more. The glowing lights that burned without flame, the navigational devices, all the knowledge he had gained from the Guardians during the Hellborn War. But what would it serve? Shannow was caught in the no-man's land of the arcane debate. Instinctively he longed for the old view to be correct, but events had forced a different understanding on him. The old world was gone. Shannow had no wish to see it rise from the ashes. Just as he was drifting to sleep, he heard a gentle footfall on the earth. He drew a pistol and waited. The slender figure of Klaus Monet crouched beside him.
"I am sorry to intrude on you, Mynheer Shannow, but you seem a man of action, sir, and we sorely need someone like you."
Shannow sat up.
"Explain yourself."
Monet leaned in close.
"This expedition was led by Boris. We won the finance from a group of long viewers in the East, but since we have been here, a man named Skazy has become involved in the project. He has put his own men, led by Dika, in charge, and now some of the finds are being sent to him in Pilgrim's Valley."
"What kind of finds?"
"Gold bars, gems from steel boxes in one of the deep rooms. It is theft, Mynheer Shannow."
"Then put a stop to it," Shannow advised.
"I am a scholar, sir."
"Then study, and do not interfere with matters beyond your strength."
"You would condone such thievery?"
Shannow chuckled.
"Thievery? Who owns this ship? No one. Therefore there is no theft. Two groups of men desire what is here. The strongest will take what he wills. That is the way of life, Mynheer Monet. Strength always decides."
"But with you, we would be stronger."
"Perhaps, but you will never know. I leave in the morning."
"Are you afraid, Mynheer Shannow? Or do you just desire more coin? We can pay."
"You could not afford me, sir. Now leave me to sleep."
The morning sky was grey, and rain on his face woke Shannow soon after dawn. He rose from his blankets and rolled them into a tight bundle, tying them with strips of oiled hide. Then he put on his heavy, double-shouldered topcoat and saddled the stallion. Two men came walking towards him through the misty rain, and Shannow turned and waited.
"Looks like you beat us to it,"
said the first, a broad-shouldered man with a gaping gap where his front teeth should have been. His comrade was shorter and more lean. Both were wearing pistols.
"Well, don't let us stop you," continued the big man. "Be on your way."
Shannow remained silent. "Are you deficient in the hearing?" the second man asked. "You're not wanted here." A small crowd had gathered in the background, and Shannow caught sight of Heimat and Klaus Monet. Of Dika there was no sign.
"I see. Let's help him on his way," said the big man, stepping in.
But Shannow's hand shot up with fingers extended and hammered into his throat. He fell back choking, then sank to his knees. Shannow's eyes fixed on the second man.
"Be so kind as to tie my blanket roll to my saddle," he said softly.
The man swallowed hard and licked his lips, his hand hovering over the pistol butt.
"Today," stated Shannow, "is not a good day to die. A man should at least see the sun in the heavens."
For several seconds the man stood tense. Then he cast a nervous glance at his comrade, who was kneeling and holding his throat, his breathing hoarse and ragged. He knew he should grab for his pistol, but he could not make his hand obey him. His eyes flickered up to meet Shannow's. "Damn you!" he whispered. His hand fell away from the gun, and he moved to the blanket roll, swinging it over the back of the saddle and tying it into place. "Thank you," said Shannow. "And now see to your friend." He stepped into the saddle and swung the stallion towards the north. The crowd parted, and he resisted the urge to glance back. Now was the moment of greatest danger, but there was no shot. He angled the stallion down to where Fray McAdam's wagon had been camped. It was gone. Shannow was angry with himself. There was no need to have shamed the men Dika had obviously sent to see him on his way. He should have mounted and left as they'd asked him. Only pride had prevented him from doing just that, and pride was a sin in the eyes of the Almighty. "That is why you cannot find Jerusalem, Shannow," he told himself. "Your sins burden you down." There is no Jerusalem. The thought leapt unbidden to his mind, and he shivered. He had seen so much in these last few years, and his doubts were many. But what choice do I have, he wondered. If there is no Jerusalem, then all is in vain. And so the search must go on. For what purpose? For me. For as long as I search, then Jerusalem exists, if only in my mind. And that is enough. I need no more. You lie, Shannow. Yes, I lie. But what does that prove? I must search. I must know. Where next will you search? Beyond the Great Wall, and if not there, to the ends of the earth and the borders of hell. Coming to the top of the rise, he turned west, seeking the pass through the mountains. He rode the deer trails for more than 2 hours before joining the main track, which was scarred by the rims of wagon wheels and the hooves of many horses. The rain had ceased, and the sun broke clear of the clouds. He rode more warily now, halting often and studying his surroundings. With the sun at its height, he stopped and rested in the shadow of a looming natural pillar of stone. It was cool here, and he read his Bible for an hour, enjoying the Song of Solomon. By mid-afternoon, the Jerusalem man had passed the mountains and was following a narrow track down into the valley beyond. To the west, he could see the McAdam wagon following the wider trail which led into the town. To the north, beyond the buildings, the valley stretched for miles, ending in a huge wall that vanished into the distance. Shannow drew a long glass from his bags, and through it he scanned the wall. It was massive, and even at this distance he could make out the flowers and lichens sprouting between its great blocks. He transferred his gaze to the sky, seeking the wonders beyond the wall, but only huge white clouds could be seen gently rolling across the vault of heaven. Hitching himself round in the saddle, he focused on the McAdam wagon. The woman was at the reins. He could see her honey-blonde hair and the flesh of her right leg as it rested against the brake. The children were walking behind, leading the horse. They would be in the town long before Shannow. He studied the buildings below. Most were wood structures, some timber, some log, but there were stone dwellings of several stories, mostly at the eastern end. There appeared to be one main thoroughfare stretching for around 400 paces, and then, in the shape of a T, buildings branched north and south of it. It was a thriving community, and many more dwellings were in the process of completion. Beyond the town was a meadow packed with tents, large and small, and Shannow could see more than a dozen cook fires. Families were moving in to settle the land, and soon Pilgrim's Valley would house a city. Shannow considered avoiding the town and riding on to the wall and beyond, but the stallion needed rest and grain feeding, and the Jerusalem man had not slept in a bed in what seemed an age. He rubbed at his chin and imagined a long, hot bath and the feel of a razor on his face. His clothes, too, were way overdue for cleaning, and his boots were leaf-thin. Flicking a glance at the wagon, he could no longer see the driver, nor the flesh of her leg at the brake. Chapter 10. Oshiri eased his swollen, misshapen frame into the room and tried to sit down in a wide chair. The discomfort was supreme. The muscles of his back no longer stretched as they should. He rose and squatted on his haunches, watching the dark lady as she sat statue still at the huge desk. Her eyes were closed, her spirit absent from her body. O'Sherry knew where she flew. She was deep down inside the drying smear of his blood that stained the crystal on her desk. O'Sherry sat silently until Creena stretched her back and opened her eyes. She cursed softly.
"You must not be impatient," said O'Sherry.
The black woman turned and smiled.
"Time races away from me," she replied. "How are you feeling?"
"Not good, Creena. Now I know how Shiran felt, and why he left. Perhaps I should go too."
"No, I will not hear such talk. I am close, O'Sherry. I know I am. All I need to find out is why the daughter molecules depart from the norm. They should not. It is against nature."
O'Sherry chuckled.
"Are we not against nature, my dear? Did God ever intend a lion to walk like a man?"
"I am not worthy to discuss God's hymns, O'Sherry. But your genetic structure was altered hundreds of years ago, and now it is reverting. There must be a way to halt it."
"But that is what I'm saying, Creena. Perhaps God wants us back the way he created us."
"I should never have told you the truth," Creena whispered.
His tawny eyes locked on her dark face.
"We have left the others in the joy of their myths, but it is better for me to know the truth. Dear Lord Creena, I am a lion. I should be padding the forests and the mountains, and I will be."
"You were born as a human," she told him, "and you grow into a man, a fine man, O'Sherry. You were not intended to prowl the wilds. I know it."
"And Shiran was? No, Creena, you are a fine scientist, and you have cared for the people of the Diani, but I think your emotions are ruling your intellect. We always thought that we were the chosen people. We saw the statues in the cities and believed that man was once subservient to us. The truth may not be palatable, but I can live with it. It will not change the law of the One, that O'Sherry becomes a lion."
"Nor if he does not," said Creena. "Someone, a long time ago, began an experiment on chromosome engineering. The reasons I can only guess at. But the chain of life was altered in several species, and this was successful. Until now. What could be done then can be done now, and I will find a way to reverse the process."
"The bears have all reverted," he pointed out. "The wolvers are dying. And did you not make the same promise to Shiran?"
"Yes, damn you, I did. And I'll say it to the next unfortunate. I'll keep saying it until I make it true."
O'Sherry looked away.
"Forgive me, Creena. Do not be angry."
"Dear God, I'm not angry with you, my dear. It is me. I have the books inside my head and the knowledge, but the answer eludes me."
"Take your mind from it for a while. Walk with me."
"I can't. I have no time."
O'Sherry pushed himself painfully to his feet, his great head lolling to one side.
"We both know that a tired mind will find no answers. Come, walk with me on the hillside."
He put out his hand, sheathing the talons that leapt unbidden from the new sockets at the ends of his swollen fingers. She put her fingers into the black mane on his cheek and kissed him gently.
"Just for a little while, then."
Together they walked along the statue-lined hall and out into the bright sunlight blazing down on the terraced gardens. He stopped at a long marble bench and stretched himself along it. She sat beside him with his head resting on her lap.
"Tell me again of the fall," he said.
"Which one?"
"The disaster that destroyed Atlantis, the one with the Ark."
"Which Ark?" she asked him. "During the between times there were more than 500 legends involving great floods. The Hopi Indians, the Arabs, the Assyrians, the Turks, the Norse, the Irish, all had their own racial memories of the day the world toppled, and each had their ark. For some it was gopher wood, for others reeds. Some were giant vessels, others huge rafts.
But the between times people did not believe the legends, did they?"
"No," she admitted. "It was part arrogance. They knew the earth had changed, that the axis was no longer what it was, but they believed it was a gradual happening. However, the evidence was there. High water marks on the sides of mountains, seashells found in deserts, huge bone graveyards of animals found in mountain caves, where they must have gathered to escape the floods."
"And why did the earth topple, Krina, that first time?"
She smiled down at him. "Your desire for knowledge is insatiable, and you know I will not tell you the secrets of the second fall. You are too guileless to attempt cunning or sherry."
"Tell of the first fall. Tell me."
"I do not have all the answers. There was tremendous seismic activity. Tidal waves rolled across the lands, thousands of feet of rushing water. There are indications in legend I have read of the sun and the moon reversing their motions, the sun rising in the west. That phenomenon could only have been caused by the earth suddenly rolling. One of my teachers believed it was the result of a meteor striking the earth. Another claimed it was the increasing weight of ice at the poles. Perhaps it was both. Many legends talk of the Atlanteans finding a source of great power and disturbing the balance of the world. They did indeed find such a power source. Who knows the truth? Whatever the answer, the roaring seas destroyed much of the world, and most of the continent that had been Atlantis sank beneath the new oceans."
"Did no Atlanteans escape?"
"Some who lived in the far north survived. Another group lived on a large island which had once been a mountain range. It used to be called the Canaries. They lived there undisturbed until the middle 1300s AD. Then they were discovered by a seafaring nation called the Spanish. The Spanish butchered them all, and the language and the culture were destroyed for all time."
"Between times people were unusually harsh," said Oshiri. "Most of your stories concerning them deal with death and destruction."
"They were harsher than you could possibly imagine," Krina responded.
"And the second fall was worse than the first?"
1,000 times worse. By then the world's population had multiplied many times, and almost 80% of them lived in lands that were at best no more than 100 feet above sea level. Some were below it, and relied on sea walls or dikes. When the earth toppled, they were destroyed utterly.
"And yet man survived, as did the people of the Diani."
"We are tough, Oshiri, and incredibly resourceful, and God did not want us all to die."
"But is human man still evil and harsh? Does he still slaughter his fellows beyond the wall?"
"He does. But not all men are evil. There are still those who resist the spell of the land."
"When they breach the wall, will they come peacefully?"
"I don't know, Oshiri. Now I must return to my work."
Oshiri watched the woman walk to her laboratory. Her skin was ebony dark and glistened as if oiled, and the undulating sway of her hips was a joy to behold. He realized he was now appreciating her beauty on a more aesthetic plane, yet another sign of the impending change. He raised himself from the bench and ambled down the terraces until he came to the main street. Everywhere there were people moving about their business. They saw him and bowed low, as befitted a man soon to be a god. A god? The humour of it touched him fleetingly. Soon his mind would lose its intelligence. His voice would become a roar, and he would spend the rest of his days driven not by a lust for knowledge, but by the desire to fill a swaying belly. He remembered the first day when the woman known as Krina had arrived at the city. Crowds had gathered to gaze on the blackness of her skin. Priests had bowed down before her, and Oshiri's older brother, the prince Shiran, had been smitten by her unearthly beauty. She had a child with her then, a sickly boy with wide, sorrowful eyes, but he had died within the first 2 months of her stay. The physicians had been powerless. His blood, they said, was weak and diseased. Krina had mourned him for a long time. Shiran, tall and handsome and the finest athletes among the Diani, had spent his days walking with her, telling her of the legends of the Diani, showing her statues and holy buildings. At last, when they'd become lovers, he had taken her on a long walk to the mountains of the sword. She had returned dazed from the experience. Then the change had begun in Shiran. The priests gave thanks and blessed him, and a great celebration was ordered for the dwellers of the city. But Oshiri had noticed that Krina did not join in the festivities. One night he found her in the ancient Medi chamber of the palace, poring over scrolls of the lost ones, and he remembered her words. "Damn you, you bastards! Was there no end to your arrogance?" Oshiri had walked forward. In those days he too had been tall and well-formed, his eyes wide-set and tawny, his hair dark and gleaming, held in place by a band of gold. "What troubles you, Krina?" "Your whole stupid civilization," she stormed. "You know, once upon a time a people called the Incas believed that they could make people gods by cutting out their hearts." "Stupidity," Oshiri agreed. "You are no different. Shiran is being mutated into some kind of beast, and you all drink to it. I have never mocked your legends, nor sought to fill you with the arcane knowledge I possess. But this—" "What are you saying, Krina?" "How can I explain this to you? You have seen the dust and water combine to make clay, yes? Well, all living organisms are the same. We are all a combination of parts." "I know all this, Krina. Heart, lungs, liver, every child knows it." "Wait," she commanded. "I don't just mean the organs or the bones or the blood. Oh, this is impossible." Oshiri sat down facing her desk. "I'm not slow-witted. Explain it to me." Slowly she began to talk of the genetic material that was vital to all living organisms. She did not use its between-times name, deoxyribonucleic acid, nor the initials by which it became better known, but she did try to explain its importance in terms of controlling hereditary characteristics. For an hour she spoke, accompanying her words with sketches. "So," said Oshiri at last, "you are saying that these magic chains divide themselves into exact replicas? For what purpose?" With extraordinary patience, Krina moved on to talk of genes and chromosomes. At last the light of understanding dawned in Oshiri. "I begin to see. How fascinating! But how does this make us stupid? Until we are told, or discover, new knowledge, we cannot be accused of foolishness, can we?" "I guess not," said Krina.
But that is not what I meant. What I am saying is that Chiran's genetic structure is changing, mutating. The daughter chains are no longer identical to the parent, and now I know why.
Tell me.
Because you are not people. You are...
She stopped suddenly and looked away as Oshiri's tawny eyes narrowed. Finish what you were saying.
Some group in the between times inserted a different gene into your ancestors, into your basic genetic code, if you like. Now, once in maybe 5 generations, the structure breaks down and reverts. Chiran is not becoming a god. He's becoming what his ancestor was, a lion.
Oshiri rose. There are statues in the old cities which show lion-headed gods. They were worshipped. I've been educated to believe in the religion of my ancestors, and I will not throw it aside. But I will speak to you again. I will learn which is correct.
Krina rose and took his arm. I'm sorry, Oshiri. I should never have told you. You must not mention it to anyone else, especially Chiran.
It is rather too late for that,
said Chiran as he ambled into the room, his huge leonine head tilted.
I am sorry, Krina. It was rude to listen, but I could not help myself. I don't know about you, Oshiri, but I do know I never felt less like a god.
Oshiri had seen tears in the great tawny eyes and had backed away from the former lovers. Chiran had fled the city 3 months later, passing from the land without comment. Oshiri had spent the time since then with Krina, learning in secret all the dark lore of the between times, save how it fell. Then, a month ago, Oshiri himself had woken in the dawn to find his muscles racked with pain and his face strangely distended. Krina had worked ceaselessly to help him, but to no avail. Now all he wanted was to learn as much as he could about the land, the stars, and the Lord of all things. And he had one dream he held in his heart like a jewel. He wanted to see the ocean, just once. Her dreams were troubled. She was sitting at a feast, the only woman present. Around her the men were handsome and tall, their smiles easy, full of warmth and friendliness. She reached out to touch her companion, and her hand rested on his arm, felt the fur. Then she recoiled and looked up into tawny eyes that chilled her, saw the long fangs that could rend her flesh. She sat frozen as, one by one, the men became lions, their eyes no longer friendly. She awoke in a cold sweat and swung her long legs from the bed. The night was cool, and the breeze from the balcony window caressed her naked body as she walked to the balcony and gazed over the moonlit city. The people of the Diani slept now in blissful ignorance of the real doom that awaited them. She shivered and returned to the bedroom. Sleep would not come, but she was too tired to work. Wrapping herself in a warm woolen blanket, she pulled a chair to the balcony and sat beneath the stars.
"I miss you, Samuel," she said, picturing the kindly face of the husband she had lost, the father of the son she had lost. If all men had been like you, the world would have remained Eden. But all men were not as Samuel Archer had been. They were driven by greed or lust, hate or fear. She shook her head. The people of the Diani had never known war. They were gentle and conciliatory, kind and understanding. Now, like a perverse cosmic jest, they were beginning a reversion to savagery. The bear people had long since lost their humanity. Krina had journeyed with Chiran to one of their settlements close to the Pool of the Sword, and what she had seen there was terrifying. Only one human was left among them, and he had begun to revert.
"Go away from us," he had said. "We are cursed."
Now their settlement was deserted, the tribe moving to the high timberlands away from prying eyes, far from pity or loathing. A hunting roar sounded in the distance from the pride that roamed the plain before the city, and Krina shivered. Some 30 lions were living there, preying upon the deer and antelope. Yet once they had been men and women who talked and laughed and sang. Her eyes scanned the ancient buildings. Just 400 of the Diani remained, not enough to survive and grow. "Why do you see the lions as gods?" Krina had asked the old priest Menchor. "They lose the power of speech and become mindless."
"The tale of elder days,"
he replied, smiling as he closed his eyes and began to recite the opening of the book.
"First there was the goddess Meriksen, who walked under the sun and knew no words, no ancient stories, nor even the name of her father, nor even that her father had a name. The law of the One touched her, and her name was born, and she knew. Yet in knowing, she also realized that she had lost a great gift, something wonderful, and it grieved her. Her son was born, but he was no god. He was a man. He spoke like a man and walked like a man. He knew his name and the name of his mother and many more names, but he too sensed a loss, an empty place in the depths of his soul. And he was the father of the Diani, and the people grew, and they lived in the great garden with the walls of crystal. But one day the law of the One was assailed by many enemies. The land was in turmoil, the walls split asunder, and great waters destroyed the garden. The Diani themselves were almost destroyed. Then the waters subsided, and the people gazed upon a different world. The law of the One visited his presence upon Penran, and he became the prophet. He told us what was lost and what was gained. We had lost the road to heaven. We had gained the path to knowing. He was the first to lead us here, and the first to leave the path and find the road."
The old man opened his eyes.
"There is far more, Krina, but only the Diani could understand."
"You believe that knowledge prevents you from seeing heaven?"
"It is a great barrier. The soul can exist only in purity. Knowledge corrupts. It fills us with dreams and desires. Such ambition keeps our eyes from the law of the One."
"Yet a savage lion knows only hunger and lust."
"Perhaps, but he does not slay wantonly, and if his belly is full, a young antelope can walk to a pool beside him and drink in safety."
"You will forgive me for not sharing your faith."
"Even as you have forgiven me for not sharing yours." "Perhaps we are both correct," said Menchor. "For do we not have similar origins? Did you not also originate in a garden, and were you not also cast from it? And did you not also, with the sin of Adam and the crime of Cain, lose the road to heaven?"
Krina had laughed then, and politely conceded the argument. She liked the old man, but she had one last question. "What happens when, like the bears, all the Diani are lions?"
"We will all be close to God," he told her simply.
"But there will be no more songs."
"Who knows what songs are heard in the heart of a lion? But can they be more discordant than the songs of death we hear from beyond the wall?"
Chapter 11. Shannow left the stallion at the stock paddocks, paid the hostler to grain feed and groom the beast, then hitched his saddlebags over his left shoulder and made his way to the Traveller's Rest, a 3-story building to the west of the town. They had one room vacant, but the owner, a thin, sallow-faced individual called Mason, asked Shannow if he could wait for an hour while they cleaned it up. Shannow agreed and paid for a 3-day stay. He left his saddlebags behind the counter and walked into the next room, where a long bar stretched some 50 feet. The barman smiled as he entered.
"Name it, son,"
he said.
"Beer,"
ordered Shannow. He paid for the drink and took the brimming jug to a corner table where he sat with his back to the wall. He was tired and curiously on edge. His thoughts kept drifting to the woman with the wagon. Slowly the bar began to fill with working men, some straight from the mine, their clothes black, their faces streaked with grime and sweat. Shannow cast his eyes swiftly over each newcomer. Few wore pistols, but many carried knives or hatchets. He was ready to move to his room when a young man entered. He was wearing a white cotton shirt, dark trousers, and a fitted jacket of tanned leather, and he wore a pistol with a smooth white grip. Watching him move, Shannow felt his anger rise. He pulled his eyes from the newcomer and finished his beer. They always looked the same, bright-eyed and smooth as cats. The mark of the hunter, the killer, the warrior. Shannow left the bar, collected his belongings, and climbed the 2 flights to his room. It was larger than he'd expected, with a brass-fitted double bed, 2 easy chairs, and a table on which sat an oil light. He dumped his bags behind the door and checked the window. Below it was a drop of around 40 feet. Stripping off his clothes, he lay back on the bed and slept for 12 hours. He awoke ravenous, dressed swiftly, strapped on his guns, and returned to the ground floor. The owner, Mason, nodded to him as Shannow approached.
"I could do with a hot bath," he said.
"Outside and turn to your left. About 30 paces. You can't miss it."
The bathhouse was a dingy shed in which 5 metal tubs were separated by curtains hung on brass rings. Shannow moved to the end and waited while 2 men filled the bath with steaming water. Then he stripped and climbed in. There was a bar of used soap and a hard brush. He lathered himself clean and stepped from the tub. The towel was coarse and gritty, but it served its purpose. He dressed, paid the attendants, and wandered across the main street, following the aroma of frying bacon. The eating-house was situated in a long cabin under a sign of the Jolly Pilgrim. Shannow entered and found a table against the wall, where he sat facing the door.
"What will you have?"
asked Beth McAdam. Shannow glanced up and reddened. Then he stood and swept his hat from his head.
"Good morning, Fray McAdam."
"The name's Beth, and I asked what you wanted."
Eggs, bacon, whatever there is."
"They've got a hot drink here made from nuts and tree bark. It's good with sugar."
"Fine, I'll try some." "It did not take you long to find work."
"Needs must," she said, and walked away.
Shannow's hunger had evaporated, but he waited for his meal and forced his way through it. The drink was bitter, even with the sugar, and black as the pit, but the aftertaste was good. He paid from his dwindling store of barter coins and walked out into the sunshine. A crowd had gathered, and he saw the young man from the night before standing in the centre of the street.
"Hey, old man, it's easy," he said. "You just stand there and drop the jug any time you're ready."
I don't want to do this, Clem," said the man he was addressing, a portly miner. "You might kill me, goddammit."
"Never killed no one yet with this trick," said the pistolier. "Still, there's always a first time."
The crowd hooted with laughter. Shannow stood against the wall of the eating-house and watched the crowd melt away before the 2 men, forming a line on either side of them. The fat miner was standing some 10 feet from the pistolier, holding a clay jug out from his body at arm's length.
"Come on, Gary, drop it," someone shouted.
The miner did so, as Shannow's eyes flicked to the pistolier. His hand swept down and up, and the crack of the shot echoed in the street. The jug exploded into shards, and the crowd cheered wildly. Shannow eased himself from the wall and walked around them towards the hotel. "You don't seem too impressed," said the young man as Shannow passed.
"Oh, I was impressed,"
Shannow assured him, walking on. But the man caught up with him. "The name's Clem Steiner," he said, falling into step.
"That was exceptionally skillful," commented Shannow. "You have fast hands and a good eye."
"Could you have done it?"
"Never in a million years,"
Shannow replied, mounting the steps to the hotel. Returning to his room, he took the Bible from his saddlebag and flicked through the pages until he came to the words that echoed in his heart.
"And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful."
Shannow closed the book.
A great high wall.
Just like the one at the end of the valley.
He hoped so. By God, he hoped so.
Awoken by the sound of gunshots, Shannow rolled from the bed and moved to the side of the window, glancing down into the moonlit street below. 2 men lay sprawled in the dust. Still standing was Clem Steiner, a pistol in his hand. Men were running from the drinking houses and the sidewalks. Shannow shook his head and returned to his bed. In the morning he took his breakfast in the long bar, a simple bowl of hot oats and a large jug of the black drink called Baker's, after the man who had introduced it to the area some 8 years before. Boris Heimat approached his table.
"Do you mind if I join you, sir?"
he asked diffidently. Shannow shrugged, and the small, balding arcanist pulled up a chair and sat. The barman brought him a Baker's, and Heimat sat in silence for a while, sipping it.
"An interesting mixture, Mynheer Shannow. Do you know it also cures headaches and rheumatic pain? It is also mildly addictive."
Shannow put down his jug.
"Oh, no, no," said Heimat, smiling. "I mean that one acquires a taste for it. There are no harmful effects. Are you staying long in Pilgrim's Valley?"
2 more days, or maybe 3.
"Oh, it could be a beautiful place, but I fear they will have more trouble here."
"You've finished work on the ship?" Shannow asked.
Klaus and I were ordered to leave the site. Mynheer Skesi has taken over."
"I'm sorry."
Heimat spread his hands. "Oh, there was not much more to see. We dug further and found the ship was only a piece. It must have broken up as it sank, but any theory of it being a building was destroyed."
"What will you do now?"
"I will wait here for a wagon convoy and then journey back to the east. There is always an expedition to somewhere. It is my life. Did you hear the shootings last night?"
"Yes," said Shannow.
14 people have died violently here in the last month. It is worse than the Big Wide."
"There is wealth here," said Shannow. "It draws men of violence, weak men, evil men. I've seen it in other areas. Once the wealth is gone, the boil bursts."
"But there are some men, Mynheer Shannow, who have a talent for lancing such boils, are there not?"
Shannow looked into the man's pale blue eyes. "Indeed there are, Mynheer Heimat, but it seems to me there are none such in Pilgrim's Valley."
"Oh, I think there is one, sir.
But he is disinterested. Do you still seek Jerusalem, John Shannow?
I do, and I'm no longer Lance Boyles.
Heimat looked away and changed the subject. I met a travelling man 2 years ago who said he had been south of the Great Wall. He talked of astonishing wonders in the sky, a great sword that hung below the clouds, a crown of crosses above its silver hilt. Less than 100 miles from it, there was a ruined city of incredible size. Oh, I would sell my soul to see such a city.
Shannow's eyes narrowed. Do not say that, even lightly. You might be taken up on it.
Heimat smiled. Oh, my apologies, sir. I forgot momentarily that you are a man of religion. Do you intend to venture past the wall?
I do.
It is a land of strange beasts and great danger.
There is danger everywhere, Mynheer. 2 men died on the street last night. There is no safe place in all the world.
That is increasingly true. Since the last full moon there have been, in Pilgrim's Valley alone, 6 rapes, 8 murders, 6 fatal shootings, and innumerable injuries from knife fights and other brawls.
Why do you retain such figures? Asked Shannow, finishing his bakers.
Habit, sir.
He produced a wad of paper and a pencil from the bulging pocket of his coat.
Would you do me the kindness, sir, of telling me the whereabouts of the giant ship you saw in your travels?
For almost half an hour, Heimat questioned the Jerusalem man about the ghost ship and the ruined cities of Atlantis. Finally, Shannow rose, paid for his breakfast, and strolled onto the street. For most of the morning he toured the town. It was quiet at the western end, where most of the houses betrayed the wealth of the inhabitants, but towards the east, where the buildings were more mediocre and flimsy, he saw several scuffles outside taverns and drinking-houses. At the end of the town was a vast meadow, filled by tents of various sizes. Even here there were drinking areas, and he saw drunkards sitting or lying on the grass in various stages of stupor. The town had sprung up around a silver mine, and this had attracted vagrants like ants to a picnic. And with the vagrants came the brigands and the thieves, the dice-rollers and the carnat players. He left the tent town and moved back along the main thoroughfare. The sound of children singing came from a long, timber-built hall. He stopped for a while and listened to the tune, trying to place it. It was a pleasant sound, full of youth and hope and innocent joy. At first it lifted him, but this was followed by a sense of melancholy and loss, and he walked on. Outside the Traveller's Rest, a large crowd had gathered, and a man's voice could be heard, deep and stirring. Shannow joined the crowd and looked up at the speaker, who was standing on a barrel. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with thick red hair tightly curled. He wore a black robe, belted at the waist with grey rope, and a wooden cross hung from a cord around his neck.
"And I say to you, brothers, that the Lord is waiting for you. All he wants is a sign from you, to see your eyes lifted from the mud at your feet, lifted towards the glories of heaven, to hear your voices say, 'Lord, I believe.' And then, my friends, the joys of the Spirit will flow in your souls."
A man stepped forward.
"And then he'll make us wear pretty black dresses like that one, eh? Tell me, parson, do you have to squat to piss?"
"Such is the voice of ignorance, my brothers,"
began the parson, but the man shouted him down. "Ignorance? You puking son of a bitch! You can take your puking Jesus and tell him to go—" The parson's booted foot flashed out, catching the man under the chin and catapulting him from his feet.
"As I was saying, dear friends," he continued, "the Lord waits with love in his heart for any sinner who repents. But those who persist in evil ways will fall to the sword of God, to burn in lakes of hellfire.
Put aside evil and lust and greed. Love your neighbour as yourself. Only then will the Lord smile on you and yours, and your rewards will be all the greater."
"Do you love him, parson?" shouted another man in the crowd, pointing down at the unconscious heckler.
"Like my own son," replied the parson, grinning. "But children must first learn discipline. I will stand bad language, for that is the way of sinful man, but I will not stand for blasphemy or any insult to the Lord. Faced with such, I will smite the offender hip and thigh, as Samson among the Philistines."
"How do you feel about drinking, parson?" called a man at the back.
"Nice of you to ask, my son. I'll have a strong beer."
As the laughter began, the parson raised his arms for silence.
"Tomorrow is the Sabbath, and I will be holding a service beyond the town of tents. There will be singing and praise, followed by food and drink. Come with your wives, your sweethearts, and your children. We'll make a day of it in the meadow. Now, where's that beer I was promised?"
He stepped down from the barrel and moved to the fallen man. Hoisting him to his feet, the parson lifted the man to his shoulder and marched up the steps into the traveller's rest. Shannow remained in the sunlight.
"Impressive, is he not?" asked Clem Steiner.
When Shannow turned, the young man's eyes were bright and challenging.
"Yeah,"
Shannow agreed.
"I hope the little fracas didn't trouble you in the night."
"No, it did not. Excuse me,"
replied Shannow, moving away. Steiner's voice floated after him.
"You bother me, friend. I hope we will not fall out."
Shannow ignored him. He returned to his room and checked his remaining barter coins, finding he had 7 full silvers, 3 halves, and 5 quarters. He searched his pockets and came up with the gold coin he had found in Chiron's food store. It was just over 1 inch in diameter, and upon the surface was stamped the image of a sword surrounded by stars. The reverse of the coin was blank. Shannow took it to the window to examine it more closely. The sword was of an unusual design, long and tapering, and the stars were more like crosses in the sky. The thunder of hooves sounded from the street, and a large group of riders came hurtling into sight. Shannow opened the window to see the body of a beast being dragged in the dust, behind 2 of the riders, and a large crowd gathering. The horsemen pulled up their mounts, and Shannow was amazed to see the bloodied beast rise up on all 4s and then lurch to its hind legs. It ran, but a rope pulled it up. 2 shots exploded, and gaping wounds appeared on the creature's back. Several more of the onlookers produced guns, and the beast was smashed from its feet. Shannow left his room and moved swiftly down the stairs. On the street beside the Traveller's Rest was a store, outside which stood several barrels and a stack of long wooden axe, or pick, handles. Lifting one of them, Shannow walked down into the milling group of riders and stopped before a bearded man on a black horse. The pick handle slashed through the air to hammer into the man's face. His body flew back over the saddle and hit the ground, raising a cloud of dust. Shannow dropped the club on the rider's body and, taking hold of the pommel of the saddle, vaulted to the stallion's back. There was silence now as Shannow eased the horse past the stunned riders. He tugged on the reins, turning the stallion to face the group.
"When he awakes, point out to him the perils of stealing a man's horse," Shannow told them. "Make it clear to him. I will leave his saddle with the hostler."
"He'll kill you for this, friend," said a young man close to him.
"I'm no friend of yours, child, nor ever will be."
Shannow rode on, pausing only to glance down at the dead beast. It looked almost exactly as Chiron had in those last days. The spreading lion's mane, the hideously muscled shoulders. Shannow touched his heels to the stallion's flanks and cantered down to the stables, where the hostler came out to meet him.
I'm sorry, mynheer, but I couldn't stop him. There were 8, 10 of them. They took 3 other horses that weren't theirs."
"Who were they?" The thieves.
"They ride for Scarsy," replied the man, as if that answered everything. Shannow dismounted and led the stallion into the stable. He stripped the saddle from him and flung it in a corner. Then he groomed the horse, rubbing the leather from him and brushing the gleaming back. "It's a fine horse," said the hostler, limping forward. "Must be 17 hands. I'll bet he runs like the wind."
"He does. What happened to your leg?"
"Timber cracked in the mine years ago. Busted my knee. Still, it's a damn sight better living above ground than below. Not so much coin, but I breathe a lot easier. What was all the shooting?"
"They killed the lion they captured,"
Shannow told him. "Hell, I'd like to have seen that. Was it one of them man-demons?"
"I do not know. It ran on its hind legs."
"Oh, Lord, what a thing to miss! There ain't so many as there was, you know. Not since the gates vanished on the wall. We used to see 'em often in the spring. They killed a family near Silverstream. Ate 'em all, would you believe me? Were it male or female?"
"Male,"
said Shannow. "Yep. Never seen no females. Must be beyond the wall, I reckon."
"Does anyone ever go there?"
"Beyond the wall?" queried the hostler. "No way. Not ever. Believe me, there's beings there to frizzle a man's soul."
"If no one goes there, how can you know?"
The hostler grinned. "No one goes there now. But 5 years ago there was an expedition. Only one man of 42 started out, got back alive. It was him that told about the sword in the sky, and he only lived a month, what with the wounds and the gases in his body. Then, 2 years ago, the gateways vanished. There were 3 of them, 20 feet high and as broad. Then one morning they were gone."
"Filled in, you mean?"
"I mean, gone. Not a trace of 'em, and no mark of any breaks in the wall. Lichens and plants growing over old stones, like there was never no gates at all."
She knew the problem and could see the results, yet she was powerless to change the process, just as she had been powerless to save her son. The woman known as Krina prowled the medichamber, her dark eyes angry, her fists clenched. One small Sipstrassi stone could change everything. One fragment with its gold veins intact could save Oshiri and others like him. Little Luke would have been alive, and Shiran would still have been standing beside her, tall and proud. She'd searched the mountains and the valleys, had questioned the Diani, but no one had ever seen such a stone, black as coal and yet streaked with gold, warm to the touch and soothing to the soul. She blamed herself, for she had carried her own stone to this distant land and had used it to seal the wall. One great surge of Sipstrassi power to wipe out the gates which would have allowed man to corrupt the lands of the Diani. And then she had made the great discovery. Man had already corrupted them, back before the second fall. The people of the Diani, the people of the DNA, the cat people. There had been mutants and freaks in the world for hundreds of years. Krina had been educated to believe they were the result of the poisons and toxic wastes which littered the land, but now she was beginning to see the true wickedness that was the legacy of Between. Genetic engineering gone rogue in a hostile environment. New races birthed, others, like the Diani, slowly dying. The priest here believed that the changes were gifts from heaven, but they were happening more frequently, whole families showing signs of reversion. Krina's anger rose. She had seen the books and the records back at home base. Many diseases of the between times had been treated by producing bacterial DNA and using it in commercial production. Insulin for diabetics was one such. Food production had been boosted by inserting genes for growth into pigs and cattle. Promoter genes, these had been called. But the betweeners had gone much further. May you rot in hell, she thought. Suddenly she smiled, because, of course, they were rotting in hell. Their disgusting world had been swept away by the power of nature, like blood washing the pus from a boil. And yet it had not affected the core of the infection, man himself, the ultimate carnivore, the complete killer. Even now they warred amongst themselves, butchering and plundering. The spell of the land was at work. Colossal radiation levels, toxic wastes in the air they breathed, all coming together to create abnormally high levels of aggression and violence. The circle of history spun on. Already man had rediscovered guns, and had risen to the level the world had known in the middle 1800s. It would not be long before they took to the skies, before nations were formed, and wars spread. Slowly she climbed the stairs to the observatory platform. From here she could see the streets of the city and watch the people moving about their business. Further out she could see the farmlands and the herds of cattle, and away into the distance, like a shimmering thread, the wall between worlds. She could almost hear man beating upon it, venting his rage upon the ancient stones. Krina transferred her gaze to the south, where heavy clouds drifted over the new mountains and the sword of God was hidden. She shivered. A sudden storm broke in the east, and she swung to watch the lightning fork up from the ground, the dark thunderclouds swirling furiously. A cold wind screamed across the plain, and she shivered again and stepped inside. The city would withstand the storm, as it had withstood the first fall and the terrible fury of the risen ocean. As she turned away, she failed to see a glimmer of blue within the storm, as if a curtain had flickered in the wind, showing clear skies amid the lowering black clouds. At the centre of the blue shone the golden disk of a second sun, so that, for no more than a heartbeat, 2 shadows were cast on the streets of the city. Chapter 12. The riders dismounted and gathered around the fallen man. His nose was crushed and both eyes were swelling fast. His upper lip was split and bleeding profusely. 2 men lifted him, carrying him from the street to the sidewalk outside the Jolly Pilgrim. The owner, Josiah Broom, took a bowl of fresh water and a towel and moved to join them, kneeling beside the injured man. He immersed the towel in the cool water and then folded it, placing it gently over the man's blackened eyes. "It was a disgrace," he said. "I saw it. Unwarranted violence. Despicable." "Damn right about that," someone agreed. "People like him will ruin this valley, even before we get a chance to build something lasting here," said Broom. "He stole a horse, goddammit!" exclaimed Beth McAdam before she could stop the words. Broom looked up. "These men were hunting a beast that could have devoured your children, and they took the first mounts they could find. All he had to do was ask the man for his horse. But no, men like him are always the same. Violence, death, destruction. It follows them like a plague." Beth held her tongue and walked back to the eating-house. She needed this job to swell the funds she had hidden in her wagon, and to pay for the children to remain at the cabin school. But men like Broom annoyed her. Sanctimonious and blinkered, they saw only what they wished to see. Beth had been in Pilgrim's Valley for only 2 days, but already she knew the political structure of the settlement. These riders worked for Edric Scasey, and he was one of the 3 most powerful men in Pilgrim's Valley. He owned the largest mine, 2 of the stores, and, with the man Mason, the Traveller's Rest, and several of the gambling houses on the East Quarter. His men patrolled the tent city, extorting payment for their vigilance. Any who did not pay could guarantee to see their wagons or their belongings lost through theft or fire. In the main, Scasey's men were bullies or former brigands. Beth had watched the beast dragged in and shot down, and had seen Shannow recover his horse. The man who stole it was bruised but alive. Shannow could have asked for its return, But Beth knew the chances were that the man would have refused, and almost certainly that would have led to a gun battle. Broom was a dung-brain of the first order. But he was also her boss, and, in his own way, a nice man. He believed in the nobility of man, that all disputes could be settled by reason and debate. She stood in the doorway and watched him tend the injured victim. Broom was tall and thin, with long, straight, sandy hair and a slender face dominated by large, protruding blue eyes. He was not an unhandsome man, and his manner towards her had been courteous. He was a widower with no children, and as such Beth had scrutinized him carefully. She knew it would be wise to find a good man with a solid base so that she could ensure security for her children. But Broom could never fill her requirements. The injured man regained consciousness and was helped to a table. Beth brought him a cup of Baker's, and he sipped it.
"I'll kill the whoreson," he mumbled. "So help me God, I'll kill him."
"Don't even think like that, Mynheer Thomas," Broom urged. "What he did was appalling, but further violence will not eradicate it." The man pushed himself to his feet.
"Who's with me?" he asked.
2 men joined him, but the others hung back. Thomas pulled his pistol from his belt and checked the loads.
"Where'd he go?"
"He took the stallion back to the stable," said a short, lean man.
"Thanks, Jake. Well, let's find him."
"Please, Mynheer," began Broom, but Thomas pushed him aside. Beth eased her way back through the kitchen and out into the yard. Then she hitched up her long skirt and ran behind the buildings, cutting through an alleyway and onto the main street ahead of the 3 men. At the end of the street, she saw Shannow talking to the hostler in the doorway of the stable. Quickly she crossed to him. "They're coming for you, Shannow," she said. 3 of them. He turned to her and smiled softly.
"It was kind of you to think of me."
"Never mind kindness. Saddle up and move."
"My belongings are still in my room. I would suggest that you wait here."
"I said there are 3 of them."
"Is the man I struck among them?"
"Yes," she told him. Shannow nodded, removed his coat, and laid it across the stall beam. Then he moved out into the sunlight. Beth crossed to the doorway and watched him make his way to the centre of the street. There he stood and waited with arms hanging by his sides. The sun was high now, shining in the faces of the 3 pistoliers. They came closer, the 2 on the outside angling themselves away from Thomas in the centre. Beth felt the tension rise.
"Now, how'd you feel, you whoreson?"
shouted Thomas. Shannow said nothing.
"Cat got your tongue?"
Closer now they came, until only about 10 paces separated them. Then Shannow's voice sounded low and clear.
"Have you come here to die?"
he asked. Beth saw the man on the right rub sweat from his face and glance at his friend. Thomas grabbed for his pistol, but a single shot punched him from his feet. His legs twitched in the dust, and a slow stain spread on the front of his trousers. The other 2 men stood statue still.
"I would suggest," said Shannow quietly, "that you carry him off the street."
They hurried to obey as he walked back to Beth and the hostler.
"I thank you again, Fray McAdam. I'm sorry that you needed to witness such an act."
"I've seen dead men before, Mynheer Shannow, but he has a lot of friends, and I don't think it'll be safe for you here. Tell me, how did you know those others would not fight?"
"I did not," he told her, "but he was the man carrying the anger. Will you be going to the parson's gathering tomorrow?"
"Might be."
"I would be privileged if you and your children would accompany me."
"I'm sorry, Mynheer," said Beth. "I think you are now in some peril, and I will not allow my children to be in your dangerous company."
"I understand. You are correct, of course."
"Were I without children, the answer might have been different." He bowed and walked out into the sunshine.
"But he's cool,"
said the hostler. "Well, Thomas ain't going to be missed. Not by a long shot." Beth did not reply. The Jerusalem man paused on the street, where only a dark patch of blood showed where a life had been taken. He felt no regret. The dead man had made his own decision, and Shannow recalled the words of Solomon. "Such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it." It was a long walk back to his rooms, and Shannow could feel the eyes of many upon him as he strode along the dusty street. The former riders were now grouped around the eating-house, but they did not speak as he passed. Clem Steiner was waiting inside the Traveller's Rest. The young man rose as he entered.
"I knew," he said. "Something told me you were a fighter when I first seen you sitting in the long bar. What is your name, friend?"
"Shannow."
"I should have guessed it. The Jerusalem man. You're a long way from home, Shannow. Who sent for you? Brisley? Fenner?"
"No one sent for me, Steiner. I ride where I please."
"You realize we may have to go up against one another?"
Shannow stared at the young man for several seconds.
"That would not be advisable,"
he said softly.
"Damn right there. You better remember that. Mynheer Scasey would like a few words with you, Shannow. He's in the long bar."
Shannow turned away and made for the stairs.
"You hear what I said?"
Steiner called, but Shannow ignored him and climbed to his room. He poured himself a cup of water from a stone jug and sat down to wait in a chair by the window. Edric Scasey stepped from the long bar.
"He's gone, Mr. Scasey," said Steiner. "Want me to fetch him back?"
"No. Wait here for me."
He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his raven black hair cut short and swept back over his head without a parting. Clean-shaven, his face was strong and angular, the dark eyes deep-set, and he moved with smooth assurance. Reaching the door of Shannow's room, he knocked once.
"Come in. It's open,"
came a voice from within. Scasey stepped inside. His eyes fastened on the man sitting in the chair by the window, and he re-evaluated his plan. He had intended to offer Shannow employment, but this was now an option that would serve only to make the man before him more of an enemy.
"May I sit, Mr. Shannow? I thought the term was mynheer in this part of the country." "I am not from this part of the country." He walked to the chair opposite the Jerusalem man and lowered himself into it.
What is it that you want, Mr. Scasey?
Merely to apologize, sir. The man who stole your horse worked for me. He was a hot-headed youngster. I wish to assure you that there will be no revenge attacks. I've made that clear to all my riders.
Shannow shrugged, but his expression did not change.
And?
Scasey felt a flicker of anger, but suppressed it, forcing a smile instead.
There is no and. It is merely a call of courtesy, sir. Do you intend staying long in Pilgrim's Valley?
No. It is my intention to ride further south.
To seek the wonders in the sky, no doubt. I envy you that. It will be at least 3 months before I've assembled a force to cross the wall.
A force? For what purpose?
Asked Shannow.
Out of his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, quoted Scasey. He will rule them with an iron sceptre. He watched Shannow's expression change from open hostility to wariness.
So you read your scripture, sir. But what does it mean to you?
Scasey leaned forward, pressing home his advantage.
I have gathered information about the land beyond the wall and the wonders there. There are great signs in the sky. Of this there is no doubt. There is a shining sword surrounded by stars and crosses, and upon the sword is a name that no one can read, exactly as the scripture says.
What is more, the land is peopled by beasts who walk like men and worship a dark goddess, a witch who performs obscene rites among them. Or, as the scripture has it, Mr. Shannow, there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names. Or, there again, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. All these things are beyond the wall, Mr. Shannow. I intend to go there and find the sword of God.
And for this you gather brigands and pistoliers?
You would have me take farmers and teachers?
Shannow stood and moved to the window. I'm no debater, sir, nor am I a judge.
Behind him, Scasey masked a smile of triumph and remained silent. Shannow turned, his pale eyes fixed on Scasey.
But neither am I a fool, Mr. Scasey. You're a man who seeks power, domination over your fellows. You are not a seeker after truth. Down there your men are feared, but that is no business of mine.
You are correct, Mr. Shannow, when you talk of the pursuit of power. But that is not an evil thing in itself, surely. Was not David the son of a farmer, and did he not rise to be king over Israel? Was not Moses the child of a slave? God gives a man talents, and therefore it is right that he should use them. I am no wilful murderer, nor brigand. My men may be boisterous and rough, but they pay for their wares and treat the folk of this community with respect. Not one of them has been found guilty of murder or rape, and those who have been caught stealing have been dealt with by me. There will always be rulers, Mr. Shannow. It is not a sin to become one.
Shannow returned to his chair and poured a mug of water which he offered to Scasey, who refused it with a smile. As I said, I am no judge. I will not be in this community for long, but I've seen other such communities. The violence will grow, and there will be many more deaths unless order is established. Why is it, sir, that with your quest for power you have not established such order?
Because I'm not a tyrant, Mr. Shannow. The gambling places in the eastern sector are not under my jurisdiction. I have a large farm and several herds of dairy and beef cattle, and I own the largest silver mine. My lands are patrolled by my men, but the town itself, though I have interests here, is not my concern.
Shannow nodded. Did you find anything of interest in the wreck of the ship?
Scasey chuckled. I heard about your altercation. Yes, I did, Mr. Shannow. There were some gold bars and several interesting pieces of silver plate, but nothing as grand as you saw on the Titanic.
Shannow betrayed no surprise. He merely nodded, and Scasey went on.
Yes, I have seen the Titanic. I know of the Sipstrassi demon stone that resurrected it, and of your battle with Sorrento. I also am no fool, sir. I know that the world of the past contained wonders beyond our imaginings, and that they are lost to us, perhaps forever. But this new world has power also, and I will find it beyond the wall.
The demon stone was destroyed, said Shannow. If you know of Sorrento, you know of his evil and of the hell-born war he caused. Such power is not suited to men.
Scasey rose. I've been honest with you, Mr. Shannow, because I respect you. I do not seek a confrontation with you. Do not misunderstand me. I do not speak from fear. But I want no unnecessary enemies. Sipstrassi is merely a power source, not unlike the guns you wear. In evil hands it will create evil. But I'm not an evil man. Good day to you.
Scasey moved back into the hallway and continued down the stairs to where Steiner waited.
You want me to take him out, Mr. Scasey?
Stay away from him, Clem. That man would kill you. Is that a joke, Mr. Scasey? There's no one could take me with a pistol. I didn't say he could beat you, Clem. I said he would kill you.
Chapter 13. For 2 long, hot days, Nu Khasisatra walked across the Great Wide. The mountain seemed no closer, but his strength was ebbing. As a shipbuilder and a craftsman, he had long been proud of the enormous strength he could bring to bear, lifting great weights of wood or stone. But this seemingly endless walk called not for strength, but for stamina, and on this count Nu realized he was lacking. He sat down in the shade of a shallow gully and took the Sipstrassi stone from the deep pocket of his coat. He was loath to use its power, not knowing how much was left, nor how much was needed to allow him to return home to Pashad and his children. Unlike many from the city of Ad, Nu had taken only one wife, the daughter of Axin the sailmaker. He loved her from the first moment their hands had touched, and he loved her still. There was little strength in Pashad, fragile as a spring flower, but there was a well of giving in her without which Nu felt lost. The last time Nu had been in possession of Sipstrassi, it had been a fragment, a sliver no bigger than a torn fingernail. Its power had been used up in a day, fueling his strength. Forcing back the awesome power of time, turning his greying hair black and filling his muscles with the strength of youth. But what he held now was 20 times larger, the gold veins thick and pulsing with power. Nu had escaped the daggers, but he had not journeyed to Balakris. He had come to some foreign land far across the sea, where men wore strange raiment. "Use your mind, you fool," he told himself. "How can you return home unless you first know from where you are starting?" According to legend, the elder priests had used Sipstrassi to free their spirits to fly the universe. If they could do it, so could Nu Khasisatra. He moved to his knees and prayed to the Great One, using 10 of the 1,000 names known to man. Then he gripped the stone tightly and pictured himself rising through the gathering clouds above. His mind swam, and he felt suddenly free, like a ship whose anchor falls away. Opening his eyes, he found himself staring down at a white wilderness of mountains and valleys with not a trace of life. Above him the sky was blue and clear, but the landscape below was ghostly and silent. Fear swept through him. Where had he flown? He dropped towards the snow-covered world and passed into the clouds. For a time he was blind, then he broke through the grey-white mist and saw the land far below, green and lush, sectioned by snow-topped mountains and ribbon rivers, great valleys and dales, forests and plains. He scanned the horizon for signs of life, for cities or towns, but there was nothing save the vastness of nature. Nu's spirit swooped closer to the plain. Now he could see his own tiny figure in the gully below, and, some miles to the west, a camp of wagons with white canvas covers and oxen feeding on the hillside. He ventured further over the mountains and saw an ugly township with squat wooden buildings and a large gathering of people in a meadow. Passing over them, he continued south. A great wall, similar in structure to the sea wall at Ad, met his eyes, and he dropped towards it. The stones were hewn in the same way, but they were far older than Pendaric's wall. He moved on, wondering how a nation which could erect such a wall could have regressed to creating such hideous buildings as he had seen in the small town. Then he saw the city, and his heart sank. There was the domed palace, the marbled terraces, the long statue-lined road of kings, and to the south the curving line of the dock. But beyond it there was no glittering ocean, only fields and meadows. Nu hovered, scanning the people strolling the streets. Everything was as he remembered, yet nothing was the same. He sped to the temple and halted by the statue of Derach the prophet. The prophet's face was worn away, the holy scrolls in his hands reduced to no more than white sticks. Shaken beyond endurance, Nu fled back to the sky. What he had seen was like a vision from the fires of Belial, and he knew the truth. This was not some strange, distant land. This was home. This was the city of Ad. He recalled his vision of the sea roaring up and the 3 suns in the sky. This was the world of the future. He returned to his body and wept for all that had been lost, for Pashad and his sons, for Bali and his friends, and for all the people of a world soon to die, of a world that had already died. Nu Khazizatra wept for Atlantis. At last his tears dried, and he lay back against a rock, his body aching, his heart heavy. What point was there in his warnings to the people? Why had the Lord Kronos used him if there was no hope?
No hope. You of all men should know the folly of that thought.
His first ship had been caught in a terrible storm. All his money had been tied into the venture, and more. He'd borrowed heavily, pushing himself and his family into awesome debt. As the voyage was nearing completion, with the cargo secure in the hold and his fortune assured, the winds had turned foul, the sea had roared. Great waves pummeled the vessel, hurling it towards the black cliffs poised like a hammer above them. Most of his crew had panicked, flinging themselves over the side and risking almost certain death in the raging sea. Not so Nu Khazizatra. Holding to the tiller, straining with all the power in his formidable frame, he locked his gaze to the black monstrosity looming over him. At first there'd been no response, but then the sleek craft began to turn. Nu's muscles had been stretched to tearing point, but his ship missed the cliff and raced on towards the peril of a hidden reef. Only 3 out of 30 crew members remained with him, and these clung to the timbers, unable to aid their master for fear of being washed overboard. "The anchor!" yelled Nu into the teeth of the storm. Salt spray lashed his face, hurling the words back at him. Lifting one arm from the tiller, he pointed at the rope break by the iron anchor, and one of his crewmen began to haul himself back to the stern. A huge wave hit him and he lost hold. His body slid down the deck. Nu released the tiller and dived for the man, catching his tunic just as he was about to topple over the side. Clamping his right hand to a stay, Nu hauled the seaman to safety. The ship sped towards the reefs, hidden like fangs of a monster below the foaming waves. Nu staggered upright and forced a path to the tiller. The seaman struggled with the anchor brake. Suddenly it gave, and the iron weight hissed over the side. The ship shuddered, and Nu let out a cry of despair, for he believed they had struck the reef. But it was only the anchor biting hard into the coral below them. The ship bobbed, and the cliff, which had been such a threat, now became a shelter from the ferocity of the storm. The wind died down in the bay. "We're still shipping water!" shouted the crewman Nu had rescued. "Start the pump and see where the problem lies," Nu ordered, and the man raced below. The 2 other crewmen followed him, and Nu sank to the wet deck. The moon broke clear of the storm clouds as he glanced to port. Rows of jagged rocks, black and gleaming, could be seen above the swell. Had the ship struck any of them, it would have been ripped open from prow to stern. Nu hauled himself upright and moved to the starboard side. Here, too, the reef could be seen. Somehow, by some miracle, he had steered the vessel through a narrow channel between the reefs. The crewman returned. "The lever is dropping. The ship is sound, master." "You have earned a good bonus, Aquila. I'll see you get it." The man grinned, showing broken front teeth. "I thought we were finished. It looked so hopeless." Nu Khazizatra's fortune had been built on that first adventure, and his reply to Aquila was now carved on the tiller of each of his ships. "Nothing is ever hopeless, as long as courage endures." The memory of that night came flooding back to him, and he pushed himself to his feet. Despair, he realized, was as great an enemy as Shahrazad or the king's daggers. His world was doomed, but that did not mean Pashad must die. He had a Sipstrassi stone, and he was alive. "I will come for you, my love," he said, "through the vaults of time or the valleys of the damned." He glanced up at the sky. "Thank you for reminding me, Lord." Beth sat on a hillside under a spreading pine and watched the children playing on the makeshift swing-boards and seesaw planks down by the stream. The high meadow was seething with townspeople, farmers and miners, enjoying the bright sunshine and the food at the stalls. Elsewhere there were games of strength or skill, knife and hatchet hurling, rifle shooting, wrestling and boxing. The miners held a jousting tourney, where one man sat upon the shoulders of another, gripping a mock lance with a wooden ball at either end. A similar team would rush at them, and there was much shouting of encouragement as the riders proceeded to hammer their opponents to the ground. The barbecue fires were lit, and the smell of roasting beef, compliments of Edric Scasey, filled the air. Beth leaned her back to the tree and relaxed for the first time in days. Her small hoard of coin was swelling, and soon she would move the family out to the rich southland north of the wall, and there build a farm of her own on land leased from Scasey. It would be a hard life, but she would make it work. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see John Shannow standing, hat in hand.
"Good morning, Beth. Your children are far from us and in little danger. May I join you?"
"Please do," she said, and he swung round and sat with his back to the tree. She moved out to sit in front of him. "I know who you are," she told him. "The old town knows."
"Yeah," he said wearily. "I expect they do. It is a fine gathering, and people are enjoying themselves. That is good to see."
"Why did you come here?" she pressed.
"It is only a stopping place, Beth. I shall not be staying. I was not summoned here. I have not come to deal death to all and sundry."
"I did not think for one moment that you had. Is it true that you seek Jerusalem?"
"Not perhaps with the same fervour as once I had. But yes, I seek the holy city."
"Why?"
"Why not? There are worse ways for a man to live. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and my brother. Raiders came and slaughtered my family. My brother and I escaped and were taken in by another family, but the raiders hit them too. I was older then, and I killed them. For a long time I was angry, filled with hatred for all brigands. Then I found my God, and I wanted to see him, to ask him many things. I am a direct man, so I looked for him. Does that answer your question?"
"It would have, were you younger. How old are you? 40, 50?
"I'm 44 years old, and yes, I've been searching since before you were born. Does that make a difference?"
"Of course it does," she told him. "Young men, like Clem Steiner, see themselves as adventurers. But surely, with maturity, a man would come to see that such a life is wasted."
"Wasted? Yes, I suppose it has been. I have no wife, no children, no home. But for all people, Beth McAdam, life is like a river. One man steps into it and finds it is cool and sweet and gentle. Another enters and finds it is shallow and cold and unwelcoming. Still another finds it a rushing torrent that bears him on too many perils. This last man cannot easily change his course."
"Just words, Mr. Shannow, and well you know it. A strong man can do anything he pleases, live any life he chooses."
"Then perhaps I am not strong," he conceded. "I had a wife once. I put aside my dreams of the holy city, and I rode with her seeking a new life. She had a son, Eric, a shy boy who was frightened of me. And we rode, unknowingly, into the heart of the hell-born war, and I lost her."
"Did you look for her?" Or did she die? Beth asked.
She was taken by the Hellborn. I fought to save her, and, with the help of a fine friend, I did. She married another man. A good man. I am what I am, Beth. I cannot change. The world we live in will not allow me to change.
You could marry, start a farm, raise children.
And how long before someone recognizes me? How long before the brigands gather? How long before an old enemy hunts me or my children? How long? No, I will find Jerusalem.
I think you are a sad man, John Shannow. She opened the basket by her side and produced 2 apples, offering one to the Jerusalem man. He took it and smiled.
Less sad in your company, lady, for which I thank you.
Angry words instantly gathered in her mind, but she saw the expression on his face and swallowed them back. This was no clumsy attempt to bed her, nor the opening shots in a campaign to woo her. It was merely a moment of genuine honesty from a lonely fellow traveller. "Why me?" she whispered. "I sense you do not allow yourself many friends."
He shrugged. "I came to know you when I rode in your tracks. You are strong and caring. You do not panic. In some ways we are very alike. When I found the dying brigand, I knew I would be too late to help you. I expected to find you and your children murdered, and my joy was great when I found your courage had saved you."
"They murdered Harry," she said. "That is a shame. He asked if he could call on me in Pilgrim's Valley."
Beth lay down, resting on her elbows, and told Shannow the story of the brigands. He listened in silence until she had finished. "Some women have that effect on a man," he said. "Harry respected your courage, and hung on to life long enough to send me to help you. For that I think the Almighty will look kindly on him."
"You and I have different thoughts on that subject." She looked down the hill and saw Samuel and Mary making their way up towards them. "My children are returning," she said softly.
"And I will leave you," he replied.
"Will you take part in the pistol contest?" she asked. "It is being held after the parson gives his sermon. There is a prize of 100 bashes."
He shrugged. "I do not think so." He bowed, and she watched him walk away.
"Damn you, Beth," she whispered. "Don't let him get to you."
The parson knelt deep in prayer on the hillside as the crowd gathered. He opened his eyes and looked out over the throng, and a deep warmth flowed within him. He'd walked for 2 months to reach Pilgrim's Valley, crossing desert and plain, mountain and valley. He had preached at farms and settlements, performed marriages, christenings and funerals at isolated homes. He'd prayed for the sick and been welcomed wherever he walked. Once he delivered a sermon at a brigand camp, and they'd fed him and given him supplies of food and water to enable him to continue his journey. Now he was here, looking out over 2,000 eager faces. He ran his hand through his thick red hair and stood. He was home. Lifting his borrowed pistols, he cocked them and fired 2 shots in the air. Into the silence that followed, his voice rang out. "Brothers and sisters, welcome to God's holy day. Look at the sun shining in the clear blue heavens. Feel the warmth on your faces. That is but a poor reflection of the love of God when it flows into your hearts and your minds. We spend our days, brethren, grubbing in the dirt for wealth. Yet true wealth is here, right here. I want each one of you to turn to the person beside you and take their hand in friendship. Do it now. Touch, feel, welcome. For the person beside you is your brother today, or your sister, or your son, or your daughter. Do it now. Do it now in love."
A ripple ran through the crowd as people turned, mostly in embarrassment, to grasp and swiftly release the hands of the strangers beside them.
"Not good enough, brethren," shouted the parson. "Is this how you would greet a long-lost brother or sister? I will show you."
He strode down amongst them and took an elderly woman in a deep hug, kissing both her cheeks.
"God's love upon you, mother," he said.
He seized a man's arm and swung him to face a young woman.
"Embrace her," he ordered, "and say the words with meaning, with belief, with love."
Slowly he moved through the crowd, forcing people together. Some of the miners began to follow him, taking women in their arms and kissing them soundly on the cheeks.
"That is it, brethren," shouted the parson. "Today is God's day. Today is love."
He moved back to the hillside.
"Not that much love,"
he shouted at a miner who had lifted a struggling woman from her feet. The crowd bellowed with laughter, and the tension eased.
"Look at us, Lord!"
The parson raised his arms and his face to the heavens.
"Look down on your people. Today there is no killing, no violence, no greed. Today we are a family in your sight."
Then he launched into a powerful sermon about the sins of the many and the joys of the few. He had them then, as his powerful voice rolled over them. He talked of greed and of cruelty, the mindless pursuit of wealth, and the loss of joy it created.
"For what does it profit a man if he gain the world and yet lose his soul? What is wealth without love? 300 years ago the Lord brought Armageddon to the world of sin, toppling the earth, destroying Babylon the Great. For in those days evil had spread across the earth like a deadly plague, and the Lord washed away their sins, even as Isaiah had prophesied. The sun rose in the west, the seas tipped from their bowls, and not one stone was left upon another. But what did we learn, brethren? Did we come to love one another? Did we turn to the Almighty? No. We threw our noses into the mud, and we scrabbled for gold and silver. We lusted and we fought. We hated and we slew. And why? Why? He roared. Because we are men, sinful, lustful men. But not today, brethren. We stand here in God's sunshine, and we know peace. We know love. And tomorrow I will build me a church on this meadow, where the love and the peace of today will be sanctified, where it will be planted like a seed. And those of you who wish to see God's love remain in this community will come to me here, bringing wood and hammers and nails and saws, and we will build a church of love. And now let us pray."
The crowd knelt, and he blessed them. He allowed the silence to grow for more than a minute, then,
"Up, my brethren! The fatted calf is waiting. The fun and the joy are here for all. Up and be happy. Up and laugh."
People surged away to the tents and stalls, the children racing down the hill to the swing boards and the mud around the stream. The parson walked down into the throng, accepting a jug of water from a woman selling cakes. He drank deeply.
"That was well spoken,"
said a voice, and the parson turned to see a tall man with silver-streaked shoulder-length hair and a greying beard. The man was wearing a flat-brimmed hat and a black coat, and 2 pistols hung from scabbards at his hips.
"Thank you, brother. Did you feel moved to repent?"
"You made me think deeply. That, I hope, is a beginning."
"Indeed it is. Do you have a farm here?"
"No, I am a travelling man. Good luck with your church."
He moved away into the crowd. "That was the Jerusalem man," said the woman selling cakes. "He killed a man yesterday. They say he's come to destroy the wicked."
"Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But let us not talk of violence and death, sister. Cut me a slice of your cake."
Chapter 14. Shannow watched the pistol-shooting contest with interest. The competitors, 22 of them, lined up facing open ground and loosed shots at targets 30 paces away. Gradually the field was whittled down to 3 men, one of them Clem Steiner. Each was obliged to fire at plates which were hurled in the air by children standing to the right of the range. Steiner won the competition and collected his prize of 100 barters from Edric Scasey. As the crowd was beginning to disperse, Scasey's voice rang out. "We have with us today a legendary figure, possibly one of the greatest pistol shots on the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, John Shannow, the Jerusalem Man." A ripple of applause ran through the spectators, and Shannow stood silently, crushing the anger welling up in him. "Come forward, Mynheer Shannow," called Scasey, and Shannow stepped up to the line. "The winner of our competition, Clement Steiner, feels that his prize cannot be truly won unless he defeats the finest competitors. Therefore, he has returned his prize until he has matched skills with the Jerusalem Man." The crowd roared approval. "Do you accept the challenge, John Shannow?" Shannow nodded and removed his coat and hat, laying them on the wooden rail that bordered the range. He drew his guns and checked his loads. Steiner stepped alongside him. "Now they'll see some real shooting," said the young man, grinning. He drew his pistol. "Would you like to go first?" he asked. Shannow shook his head. "Okay. Throw, boy," called Steiner, and a large clay plate sailed into the air. The crack of the pistol shot was followed by the shattering of the plate at the apex of its flight. Shannow then cocked his pistol and nodded to the boy. Another plate flew up and disintegrated as Shannow fired. Plate after plate was blown to pieces, until finally the Jerusalem Man called a halt. "This could go on all day, boy," he said. "Try it too." Steiner's eyes narrowed. Another boy was sent to join the first, and 2 plates were hurled high. Steiner hit the first, but the second fell to the ground, shattering on impact. Shannow took his place, and both plates were exploded. "4," he called, and the crowd stood stock still as 2 more boys joined the throwers. Shannow cocked both pistols and took a deep breath. Then he nodded to the boys, and as the plates soared into the air, his guns swept up. The shots rolled out like thunder, smashing 3 of the spinning plates before they'd reached the top of their flight. The 4th was falling like a stone when the bullet smashed through it. The applause was thunderous as Shannow bowed to the crowd, reloaded his pistols, and sheathed them. He put on his coat and hat and collected the prize from Scasey. The man smiled. "You did not enjoy that, Mr. Shannow. I'm sorry, but the people will not forget it." "The coin will come in useful," said Shannow. He turned to Steiner. "I think it would be right for us to share this prize," he suggested, "for you had to work much harder for it." "Keep it," snapped Steiner. "You won it, but it doesn't make you the better man. We've still to decide that." "There is nothing to decide, Mynheer Steiner. I can hit more plates, but you can draw and shoot accurately with far greater speed." "You know what I mean, Shannow. I'm talking about man to man." "Do not even think about it," advised the Jerusalem Man. It was almost midnight before Broom allowed Beth to leave the Jolly Pilgrim. The morning's entertainment had spilled over into the evening, and Broom wanted to stay open to cater for the late-night revellers. Beth was not concerned about the children, for Mary would have taken Samuel back to the wagon and prepared him some supper, but she was sorry to have missed an evening with them. They were growing so fast. She moved along the darkened sidewalk and down the 3 short steps to the street. A man stepped out in front of her from the shadows at the side of the building. 2 others joined him. "Well, well," he said, his face shadowed from the moonlight by the brim of his hat. if it ain't the whore who killed poor Thomas." "His stupidity killed him," she said. "Yeah, but you warned the Jerusalem man, didn't you? You went running to him. Are you his whore, bitch?" Beth's fist cracked against his chin and he staggered. She followed in, crashing a second blow with her left that spun him from his feet. As he tried to rise, she lashed out with her foot, catching him under the chin. "Any other questions?" she asked. She walked on, but a man leapt at her, grabbing her arms. She struggled to turn and kick out, but another man grabbed her legs and she was hoisted from her feet. They carried her towards the alley. "We'll see what makes you so special," grunted one of her attackers. "I don't think so," said a man's voice, and the attackers dropped Beth to the ground. She scrambled to her feet and looked up to see the parson was standing in the street. "You keep your puking nose out of this," said one of the men, while the other drew a pistol. "I do not like to see any among the brethren behaving in such a manner towards a lady," said the parson, "and I do not like guns pointed at me. It is not polite. Go on about your business." "You think I won't kill you?" the gunman asked, "just because you wear a black dress and spat on about God? You're nothing, man, nothing." "What I am is a man, and men do not behave as you do. Only the basest animals act in such a manner. You are filth, vermin. You do not belong in the company of civilized people." "That's it," shouted the man, his pistol coming up and his thumb on the hammer. The parson's hand swept out from behind his cassock and his gun roared. The man was hurled backwards by the force of the shell as it hit his chest. Then a second bullet smashed through his skull. "Jesus Christ!" whispered the survivor. "A little late for prayers," the parson told him. "Step forward and let me see your face." The man stumbled towards him, and the parson lifted his hand and removed the man's hat, allowing the moonlight to illuminate his features. "Tomorrow morning you will report to the meadow where you will help me build my church. Is that not so, brother?" The gun pushed up under the man's chin. "Whatever you say, parson." "Good. Now, see to the body. It is not fitting that it should lie there to be seen by children in the morning." The parson moved to Beth. "How are you feeling, sister?" "I've had better days," Beth told him. "I shall walk you to your home." "That will not be necessary." "Indeed, no. But it will be a pleasure." He took her arm, and they walked off in the direction of Tent Town. "I thought your God looked unkindly on killing," said Beth. "Indeed he does, sister, but the distinction he makes concerns murder. The Bible is full of killing and slaughter, and the Lord understands that among sinful men there will always be violence. There is an apt section in Ecclesiastes. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal. There is more, and it is very beautiful." "You speak well, parson, but I'm glad you also shoot well." "I've had a lot of practice, sister." "Call me Beth. I never had no brothers. Do you have a name?" "Parson is fine, and I like the sound of Beth. It is a good name. Are you married?" "I was. Sean died on the journey, but my children are with me. I expect they're sleeping now, or they damn well better be." They made their way through the tents and wagons until they reached the macadam campsite. The fire was low, and the children asleep in their blankets beside the wheels. The oxen had been led to a second meadow, where they grazed with other cattle. Beth stoked up the fire. "Will you join me for tea, parson? I always drink a cup before sleeping." "Thank you," he answered, sitting cross-legged by the fire. She boiled some water, added herbs and sugar, and poured the mixture into 2 pottery mugs. "You come far?" she asked as they drank. "Very far. I heard God calling me, and I answered.
But what of you? Where are you bound?"
"I'll be staying in the valley. I'm going to lease some land from Mynheer Scasey, start a farm. I have some seed corn and other such."
"Hard work for a woman alone."
"I won't be alone long, parson. It's not my way."
"No, I can see that," he answered without embarrassment. "By the way, where does such a charming young mother learn the rudiments of the left hook? It was a splendid blow with all your weight behind it."
"My husband Sean was a fist fighter. He taught me that, and much more."
"He was a lucky man, Beth."
"He's dead, parson."
"Many men live a long lifetime and never meet a woman like you. They, I think, are the unlucky ones. And now I must bid you good night."
He rose and bowed. "You come again, parson. You're always welcome."
"That is nice to know. I hope we will see you in our new church."
"Only if you have songs. I like to sing."
"We'll have songs just for you," he told her, and walked away into the shadows.
For a while Beth sat quietly by the dying fire. The parson was a strong man, and extraordinarily handsome, with that fine red hair and easy smile. But there was something about him that disturbed her, and she thought about it, trying to pin down her unease. Physically she found him attractive, but there was about him a tightness, a tension that left her wary. Her thoughts strayed to John Shannow. Similar men, and yet not so. Like thunder and lightning, both were companion to inner storms. But Shannow was aware of his own dark side. She was not sure about the parson. Beth stripped off her long woolen skirt and her white blouse and washed in cold water. Then she slipped into a full-length bedgown and settled down into her blankets. Her hand moved under the pillow, curling round the walnut butt of her pistol. And she slept. During the night there were 2 killings, and a woman was raped behind a gambling house in the east section. Shannow sat silently in the corner of the long bar, drinking a baker's and listening to the tales. It seemed the parson had killed one man who was attacking a woman, but the other shooting was a mystery, save for the fact that the dead man had won a large amount of coin playing carnat at a gambling house run by a man named Weber. Shannow had seen it all before. Crooked gamblers, thieves and robbers congregating in a community that had no law. When would the upright citizens ever learn, he wondered. There were around 2,000 people in Pilgrim's Valley, and no more than 100 villains. Yet the brigands swaggered around the town, and the good people stepped aside for them. He stared sourly into the dark depths of the drink before him, and knew that he was tempted to cut away the disease afflicting the community, to storm the bastions of the ungodly and root out the evil. Yet he would not. "I no longer Lance Boyles." That's what he had told Boris Heimat, and it was true. A man could take only so much rejection and the contempt of his fellows. It always began with fine words and promises. "Help us, Mr. Shannow. We need you, Mr. Shannow." "Good work, Mr. Shannow." "That will show them, sir." And then, "But do you have to be so violent, Mr. Shannow? Is the bloodshed necessary? When will you be moving on?" But no more.